8 vehicles. Same failure. Same sequence. Same day. When a fleet of luxury SUVs belonging to one of Chicago's most powerful investment firms collapsed in identical electronic failure within 72 hours of each other. The dealership that serviced them had a very simple explanation: catastrophic system damage, irreparable without full replacement, and a repair bill approaching $200,000. What they didn't expect was for someone to actually look at the vehicles, really look. And when independent mechanic Adrian Kane did, what he found wasn't damage. It was a pattern, deliberate, quiet, and years in the making. We invite you to follow this story all the way to the end. Hit like and drop a comment telling us the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The call came in on a Thursday morning, somewhere between Adrian Kane's second cup of coffee and the moment he realized the radiator hose on Bay 2 was going to require a longer conversation with its owner than he had patience for. He almost didn't answer. The number was unlisted, which usually meant either a telemarketer or someone who'd gotten his cell from a referral and hadn't bothered to leave a message first. He answered anyway. Habit, mostly. In the independent repair business, you don't get the luxury of screening calls. "Is this Adrian Kane?" The voice on the other end was composed. Not warm exactly, but precise. The kind of voice that had spent years in rooms where imprecision cost money. "It is. My name is Victoria Langford. I'm the Executive Director of Fleet Operations at Langford Capital Group. I was given your name by Dennis Marsh at Elevate Automotive. He said you were the only mechanic in the city he'd trust if he couldn't handle the job himself." Adrian set down his coffee. Dennis Marsh had retired 2 years ago after 31 years in the business, and he didn't give out referrals unless he meant them. "Dennis said that?" "He did. Mr. Kane, I have a problem, and I've been told the problem is going to cost me $194,000 to fix. I'd like a second opinion before I write that check." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind off Lake Michigan was doing what it always did in January, finding every gap in the garage walls and coming through like it owned the place. One of his technicians, a 24-year-old named Ricky Solano, was working under the lifted frame of a Tahoe and swearing intermittently at something Adrian couldn't see. "What kind of vehicles?" Adrian asked. "Escalade ES-VI, 8 of them, 22 models, all purchased within the same 6-month window, all maintained by the same dealership, Hargrove Premier Auto Group on North Michigan. They were serviced 2 weeks ago, routine maintenance package. 72 hours later, all 8 developed electronic failures. The dealership is saying we need complete ECM replacements on 6 of them and full electrical harness rebuilds on the other 2. Adrian said nothing for a moment. He was doing the math without thinking about it, the way a doctor listens to a described symptom and starts running differentials before the patient even finishes talking. 8 vehicles, same failure window, same service event, same dealership. "All 8, he said. "All 8. Same failure presentation?" "According to the dealership, yes. Dashboard warning clusters, communication loss between modules, intermittent shutdown sequences. They're saying the systems are too compromised to function safely." "And they serviced all 8 within the same appointment block?" "They came in over 3 days, but yes, all 8 went through Hargrove's service department within a 72-hour window. The failures started appearing about 3 days after the last vehicle was returned to us." Adrian pulled a stool out from under the workbench and sat on it. Through the smudged office window that looked out over the bay, he could see Ricky had extracted himself from under the Tahoe and was now standing with his arms crossed, staring at something with the particular expression of a man who has found a new problem. "Ms. Langford," Adrian said, "I have to be honest with you. What you're describing doesn't fit the diagnostic profile of spontaneous system failure in those vehicles. It fits something else." "I assumed that might be the case," she said, "which is why I'm calling you instead of writing the check. When can you see the vehicles? Can you get me access to one of them today?" "I can get you access to all 8. Victoria Langford was not what Adrian had constructed in his head during the 45-minute drive to the Langford Capital Group parking structure on West Monroe. He'd built her as the type, older, expensively tailored, speaking from behind a desk the size of a dining room table with an assistant standing nearby ready to refill her water glass. The kind of executive who called mechanics the way they called plumbers. with the expectation that the problem would be explained in simple terms and resolved without requiring them to look at anything unpleasant. She was waiting for him in the parking structure herself, standing next to the first Escalade in a gray wool coat and flat shoes, holding a tablet. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from discipline. She extended her hand when he approached. "Mr. Kane." "Adrian," he said, shaking it. "Victoria." She looked him over briefly, not judgmentally, just registering. He'd worn his cleanest work pants and a thermal under a canvas jacket, which was approximately as dressed up as he got for a client meeting. "Thank you for coming on short notice. I know this is an unusual arrangement." "It's fine." He looked at the Escalade behind her. Someone had placed a yellow caution cone near the front wheel well, which struck him as almost ceremonially pointless in a private parking structure. "You mind if I start?" "Please." He opened the driver's door and slid in without ceremony. The interior smelled like leather conditioner and the faint chemical trace of recent cleaning, the fleet maintenance kind, not the personal kind. He pressed the start button. The dashboard lit up immediately, then populated with a cluster of warning indicators that came on in a sequence, overlapping, a cascade of amber and red that looked alarming if you didn't know what you were looking at. But Adrian knew what he was looking at. He sat there for about 40 seconds just reading the warning pattern without touching anything else. Then he plugged his diagnostic interface into the OBD2 port under the dash and let it run. Victoria had moved to stand near the open driver's door. She was watching him without speaking, which he appreciated. A lot of clients narrated. They stood over you and described what they were seeing as though you weren't looking at the same thing. She just watched. "What do you see?" she asked after about 2 minutes. "Right now I'm reading the fault codes." He turned the tablet so she could see the screen. "You've got a U-code cluster here. Network communication faults. Module A isn't talking to Module B. Module B isn't talking to the BCM. On its face, that reads like a catastrophic network failure, which is what Hargrove told you. And it's not? I didn't say that yet." He looked back at the readout. "What I'm saying is that a U-code cluster by itself doesn't tell you why the network went down. It just tells you the network went down. The question is whether the network hardware failed or whether something interrupted the network signal." "What's the difference in practical terms?" "About $190,000. He let that land, then added, "The hardware failure scenario is what Hargrove is selling you. Complete ECM replacement, harness rebuilds, the whole package. But if the network went down because of a signal interruption, a blown fuse, a corroded connection, a failed relay, the fix is cheap. Sometimes less than $100 in parts." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled through the parking structure's lower level, the sound echoing off concrete. "And you think that's what this is?" she said. "I think all 8 vehicles failing in the same pattern 3 days after the same service appointment is not a coincidence," Adrian said. "I don't know what it is yet, but I know what it's not." He spent 4 hours with the vehicles that afternoon. He didn't tear into any of them, not yet. He ran diagnostics on all 8 first, reading the fault code profiles on each one, noting the timestamps in the error logs, cross-referencing the warning sequences. Ricky had come with him and was running the second diagnostic tablet while Adrian worked the first, and they moved through the Escalades in order, bay to bay, the parking structure cold enough that both men were breathing visible air. By the third vehicle, Adrian had what he needed. The fault code clusters were nearly identical across all 8. Not similar. Identical. Same communication loss sequence, same module dropout order, same timestamp spread between initial fault and full system cascade. That kind of replication in 8 separate vehicles didn't happen by accident. Electronics didn't fail that consistently. Mechanical systems had variables, age, use patterns, environmental exposure. Even identical vehicles maintained under identical conditions would show variance in the way they failed. Entropy didn't care about uniformity. Unless the failure had been introduced uniformly. He didn't say this to Victoria yet. He wasn't ready to say it. Saying it required more than a pattern. It required an explanation, and the explanation was still forming. What he did say, standing in the parking structure with the diagnostic tablets under his arm, and Ricky beside him working a cup of gas station coffee like his life depended on it, was this. I need to look at one of these more thoroughly. Full inspection. I want to trace the power distribution to the module network and check the fuse and relay assembly. How long? Victoria asked. Few hours. Can you release one to me today? She looked at the row of Escalades with an expression Adrian couldn't quite read. Mr. Kane, I need to be clear about something. My legal team has already been contacted by Hargrove's corporate office. They've indicated that any unauthorized disassembly of the vehicles could void remaining warranty coverage and expose us to liability for the repair costs. Adrian looked at her. Is that what they said? That was the substance of the call, yes. He held her gaze for a moment. Ms. Langford, Victoria. In my experience, dealerships don't threaten liability when they're confident in their diagnosis. They threaten liability when they're not. She absorbed that. Then she said, one vehicle. I'll have it transported to your garage by this afternoon. The Escalade arrived on a flatbed at 4:15, driven by a guy named Trevor, who worked for the transport company Victoria used. Trevor had a neck tattoo and a cheerful disposition that Adrian found genuinely refreshing after the parking structure's ambient tension. He dropped the vehicle in Bay 1, Adrian signed the paperwork, and Trevor was gone in under 10 minutes. It was just the two of them now, Adrian and the truck. Ricky had gone home. He had a daughter who was 8 months old and a partner who worked nights, which meant Tuesdays and Thursdays were his to manage alone. And he managed them with a focus and competence that Adrian respected more than he usually said. Before he left, Ricky had stood in the bay doorway and looked at the Escalade the same way he looked at most complicated things, with skepticism and something close to personal offense. You know what they did, right? He said. I have a theory, Adrian said. If it's the fuse, I'll know in a couple hours. Ricky nodded like a man being careful not to get ahead of the evidence, which was a habit Adrian had worked to instill in him and was quietly glad to see taking hold. Then he left. Adrian put on his headlamp, pulled the vehicle information specs he'd downloaded that afternoon, and went to work. The Power Distribution Center in the 2022 Escalade ES5 lived under the hood, driver's side, a black housing about the size of a hardback novel. It managed the fuse and relay layout for the vehicle's major electrical systems, including the module communication network that had apparently decided to stop communicating. Adrian popped the cover and began working through the fuse matrix with a circuit tester, methodical and unhurried, the way his first real boss had taught him. You're not looking for the obvious thing, you're looking for the thing that isn't where it should be. He found it in 40 minutes. A maxi fuse in position F17, the communication network supply fuse, was blown. Not cracked, not degraded, not showing signs of gradual failure, cleanly blown. The kind of failure profile you got when a fuse absorbed a voltage spike it wasn't rated to handle. He sat back on his rolling stool and looked at it. $20. $30, maybe, if you were buying from a dealership parts counter with their markup. The fuse itself was rated for 40 amps. He pulled it out with the fuse puller and held it under the work light, checking the internal element. Blown clear. Clean break across the element bridge, which told him the failure had been fast. Not a long, slow thermal burn, but a sudden overcurrent event that had taken the bridge out in a single event. He checked the fuse position against the wiring diagram. F17 fed power to the central gateway module, which was the hub of the vehicle's internal communication network. When F17 went, the gateway went down. When the gateway went down, the modules that depended on it for network coordination started throwing communication faults. When the modules threw communication faults, the dashboard lit up like a carnival, which looked, to anyone reading the diagnostic output without understanding what they were looking at, like catastrophic system failure. It was not catastrophic system failure. It was a blown fuse. Adrian set the fuse down on his workbench and stood in the bay for a moment, listening to the wind find the gap under the roll-up door. The shop had been his for 6 years. Before that, it had been a storage facility for a moving company that went bankrupt. Before that, he didn't know. The concrete floor had been poured in layers, which meant it was uneven in 3 places and cracked in one corner, and in winter the cold came up through it no matter how well he dressed for it. He'd learned to stop noticing. He was noticing now, though, because he needed something to do with his hands while his brain worked through what the fuse was telling him. The The fuse failure alone was explainable. Fuses failed. Voltage spikes happened. Single vehicle, single fuse, he'd have replaced it and called it a day. But 8 vehicles, same fuse, same failure profile. 3 days after the same service appointment, fuses didn't coordinate their own destruction. He went back to the power distribution center and looked more carefully at the F17 position, this time checking the contact surfaces on the fuse socket. And there it was. Faint, but there. A trace of residue around the socket interior that didn't belong. Not corrosion. Not the normal oxidation you'd see from age and thermal cycling. Something else. Something applied. He photographed it with his phone camera, then photographed the fuse, then the socket, then the wiring at the junction behind the PDC. He was thorough about it, the way a careful man is thorough about things that are going to matter later. Then he sat down at his workbench with a yellow legal pad and wrote out what he had so far. He was not a dramatic man. He didn't reach for dramatic conclusions. But sitting in his shop at 9:30 on a January night with a blown fuse on the bench and a residue trace in a socket and 8 vehicles wearing identical failure signatures, he couldn't build an innocent explanation. He'd tried. He'd run through the alternatives: shared manufacturing defect, contaminated parts batch, environmental coincidence, and none of them fit the evidence. What fit the evidence was deliberate. He called Victoria Langford at 9:43. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting. "I found the failure point," he said. A pause. "Already?" "It's a fuse, position F17 in the power distribution center. Communication network supply fuse. When it blows, the gateway module loses power, the network goes down. You get exactly the fault code cluster Hargrove showed you." Another pause, longer this time. "A fuse. $20 part. Less if you're buying in quantity." He heard her exhale, not dramatically, just the sound of a controlled person letting something go. "And the repair?" "I haven't confirmed it yet. I want to check the gateway module to make sure the fuse failure didn't cause secondary damage. But if the module's intact, you're looking at a fuse replacement and a system reset. Hour of labor, maybe. Parts under $50. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that he could hear the ambient sound of wherever she was. Something like a television at low volume, or a radio. Background sound of a late evening at home. "Mr. Kane," she said finally. The dealership's diagnostic team included 3 certified technicians and a factory-authorized systems specialist. "I know. They spent 2 days on these vehicles." "I know that too. And you found a fuse in 40 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. "The fuse isn't the hard part," he said. "The hard part is what I found around the fuse. I need to do more work before I tell you what I think it means. But I need you to know that what I'm looking at right now doesn't suggest accident." The silence was different this time. Heavier. "All right," she said. "What do you need?" "I need the service records for all 8 vehicles from the Hargrove appointment. Whatever they gave you, the written work orders, the parts documentation, anything digital. I can have those to you tomorrow morning." "Good." He looked at the fuse sitting on his workbench, small and flat and impossibly consequential. "And I need you not to contact Hargrove about this conversation." "I wasn't planning to," she said. "I know you weren't. I just needed to say it." "Understood." A beat. "Adrian, how bad is this going to get?" He thought about the residue in the socket. He thought about 8 identical failures. He thought about the pattern, the timing, the scale of the estimate that had landed on Victoria Langford's desk 2 days after her vehicles were returned from service. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I don't think it gets better before it gets worse." He didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't anxiety exactly, more like the particular restlessness of a mind that had started pulling a thread and couldn't stop. He lay in the dark in his apartment 4 blocks from the shop and ran sequences in his head, the way he always did when a job gave him something that didn't fit. The fuse, the residue, the timing, the identical failure pattern across 8 separate vehicles, each one serviced at different times over a 3-day window, each one failing in the same sequence 3 days after the last vehicle returned. Whoever had done this, if someone had done this, and Adrian was becoming increasingly certain that someone had, had been methodical about it. Not panicked, not improvising. Methodical. They'd worked through 8 vehicles and applied the same intervention to each one. And they'd done it in a way that produced a diagnostic presentation clean enough to justify a $200,000 estimate. That was not amateur work, which meant either someone at Hargrove knew exactly what they were doing, or someone at Hargrove had done this before. The thought came in quietly, the way uncomfortable thoughts do. Not with fanfare. Just there, settled in the back of his mind when he finally got up at 5:30 and put the coffee on. Someone had done this before. Because expertise like that, the ability to produce a diagnostic pattern that specific, that consistent across a fleet of vehicles, that didn't come from one job. That came from repetition, from knowing exactly how the fault codes would present, exactly how the damage would read, exactly how a certified technician running a standard diagnostic protocol would interpret the output. Someone had done this before, and they'd gotten away with it. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched the sun come up slow and grudging over the city's East End. Chicago in January was never beautiful, but it had a particular kind of gray honesty that Adrian had always respected. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It was cold and flat and difficult, and it said so. He thought about the report. He hadn't let himself think about it yet. He'd held it at the edge of consciousness all evening, keeping it from coming forward while he worked through the immediate evidence. But in the 5:30 quiet of his kitchen, with the coffee going and the light coming up and nowhere left to look except directly at it, he let it come forward. 4 years ago, Adrian Kane had worked as a senior diagnostic technician at Meridian Elite Service Center, which was part of the same dealership group, Hargrove Premier, under a different operating name. Different location, same parent company, same corporate service protocols. He'd been there for 2 years. He'd been good at it. They'd paid him reasonably and given him latitude with diagnostic work, which was all he'd ever wanted from an employer. And in the spring of his second year, working on a customer complaint about intermittent electronic failures in a late model Suburban, he'd found something in the power distribution center that shouldn't have been there. He'd written it up. Formal technical report, submitted through the internal documentation system, flagged as a potential systemic issue requiring investigation across the vehicle line. He documented the fuse position, the failure mode, the diagnostic presentation that resulted. He'd recommended an internal audit of similar complaints. 3 weeks later, his access to the documentation system had been revoked. 6 weeks after that, he'd been let go. Restructuring, they'd said. The position was being consolidated. They'd given him a severance package that was slightly better than he'd expected, which he'd understood at the time as a business decision and had since come to understand as something else. The report had never been acknowledged. No audit had been conducted. No investigation had followed. And now, 4 years later, 8 vehicles were sitting in a corporate parking structure on West Monroe with blown F-17 fuses and a $200,000 estimate waiting on a desk. Adrian set down his coffee, went to his desk in the corner of the apartment, and opened his laptop. He still had the files. He'd kept them because he was the kind of man who kept documentation, not because he'd ever expected to need them. Backed up to an external drive, then to a cloud archive when cloud archiving became a habit, then largely forgotten in a folder labeled with the date and a job number that had ceased to matter. He opened the folder. The report was still there. 17 pages, including photographs of the failure component he'd found, the diagnostic logs he'd run, the cross-reference data he'd compiled from similar complaints in the system at the time. He read it straight through. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling. 4 years. The same failure mode, the same vehicle system, the same fuse position. 4 years, and somewhere in the Hargrove Premier Service network, someone had taken the flaw he'd found and built a business model around it. That was the only way the math worked, because if it had been an isolated incident with Victoria's fleet, an opportunistic scam targeting one corporate client, the sophistication of the execution would be explainable as clever dishonesty. But a sophisticated, repeatable process that produced consistent diagnostic presentations across multiple vehicles, combined with the fact that someone had suppressed his original report and removed him from the company shortly thereafter. That wasn't opportunism. That was infrastructure. Someone had built a system, a quiet, deniable, extremely profitable system, and it had been running untouched for 4 years. He closed the laptop and sat in the early morning light and thought about what he was going to do next. He was not by nature a confrontational man. He didn't enjoy conflict. He didn't move through the world looking for fights. But he was also not, he had come to understand over the course of his 41 years, a man who could look away from something that was clearly wrong and simply continue with his life as though he hadn't looked. Some people could do that. He'd watched them do it. He'd never quite managed it himself. He picked up his phone and texted Ricky. "Early start today, 7 a.m. if you can." Ricky texted back in under a minute. The baby had been up anyway, with a thumbs up. Then Adrian got dressed, drove to the shop in the gray January morning, and started working on what he knew. The service records Victoria sent over arrived at 8:15, forwarded from her executive assistant in a clean PDF packet. Adrian spread them across the workbench, printed because he thought better with physical paper in front of him, always had, and went through them with a yellow highlighter and a mechanical pencil. Ricky stood beside him, reading over his shoulder with a cup of coffee in each hand, one of which he set near Adrian without being asked. They read in silence for about 12 minutes. "They ordered the parts before they even ran the full diagnostics," Ricky said. He said it quietly, the way you said things when you weren't sure you were seeing what you thought you were seeing, and you needed to hear it out loud to confirm it. 14 hours before the full diagnostic report was completed, Adrian said. "Look at the timestamps." Ricky looked. He set his coffee down on the corner of the workbench with the careful precision of someone who was trying not to react too fast. "ECM units for 6 vehicles. Harness rebuild kit for 2 more. All ordered at," he squinted, 11:14 a.m. on the 14th. "The diagnostic report is time-stamped 1:03 a.m. on the 15th. "That's 14 hours and 49 minutes, Adrian said. Ricky picked up his coffee again. "Put it back down. You can't order parts before you've completed the diagnosis." "You can," Adrian said, "if you already know what you're going to find." Ricky looked at him. "Or if you already know what you put in there." Adrian didn't answer that. Not yet, not out loud. But he picked up the mechanical pencil and drew a thin, precise line under the part order timestamp on page 3. And underneath it, he wrote the word sequence and circled it. The morning moved forward. Outside, the January cold did what it always did, and the city went about its business. And in Bay 1, the Escalade sat waiting with its blown fuse and its residue trace and its 40-minute diagnostic sitting directly against 2 days of certified technician work that had somehow missed all of it. Somewhere across the city, someone was waiting for a $200,000 check. They were going to wait a while longer. The second Escalade arrived at the shop on Friday morning, transported by the same flatbed driver, Trevor, who had developed an easy familiarity with the place in the span of 2 visits and arrived with a gas station breakfast sandwich that he offered to share with Ricky while Adrian signed the release paperwork. Victoria had authorized the second vehicle after Adrian's call the previous evening, and she'd done it without asking how long he needed or what it was going to cost her, which told him she'd already made up her mind about something she hadn't said out loud yet. Adrian appreciated that. He didn't like being managed while he worked. Ricky had the first Escalade already up on the lift by 7:40. The power distribution center open and photographed from 4 angles. The blown F-17 fuse sitting in a small labeled evidence bag on the workbench alongside the residue trace swab he'd taken the night before. Adrian had spent an hour that morning looking up the residue profile under his loupe and comparing it against common electrical contact compounds. It was a dielectric paste, the kind used to protect electrical connections from moisture and oxidation. Legitimate product, sold at any auto parts store. The problem was its location. Dielectric compound went on the outside of a connection. On the fuse socket's contact surfaces, inside the housing, it served no protective function. What it would do, applied in the right quantity to the right location, was increase the resistance at the contact point. Increase the resistance, and you increase the heat generated when current passed through. Increase the heat enough, and the fuse element experienced thermal stress over time, days in this case, until the element degraded and failed under normal operating load. It was not a fast process. It was not a dramatic process. It was quiet and patient and left almost nothing behind except a blown fuse and a diagnostic presentation that looked, to anyone not looking for it, like catastrophic system failure. Adrian laid this out for Ricky over the workbench, pointing to his notes on the legal pad, while Ricky ate a breakfast sandwich he'd accepted from Trevor, and looked at the information with the focused, slightly uncomfortable expression he wore when something confirmed a suspicion he'd been hoping was wrong. So they basically slow-cooked it, Ricky said. Thermal degradation through increased contact resistance. Yes. And whoever did it knew exactly how long it would take to fail. 3 days is consistent with the compound application volume I'm seeing. The vehicles were returned to the fleet Tuesday through Thursday. Failures started Sunday. Adrian looked at the swab sample. 3 days is not an accident, that's a calculation. Ricky finished the sandwich, folded the wrapper twice, and dropped it in the trash can by the lift controls with more precision than the action required. Who does this, who sits in a service bay and thinks, I'm going to apply dielectric compound to a fuse socket so it fails in exactly 3 days? Someone who's done it before, Adrian said, and got paid for it. The shop went quiet for a moment except for the hiss of the lift and the wind doing its thing outside. The second vehicle, Ricky said. Same inspection, same documentation. I need confirmation across at least 2 vehicles before I take any of this anywhere. Where are you taking it? Adrian looked at the legal pad. The report from 4 years ago was printed and sitting in a manila folder on the corner of the workbench, where it had been since 7 that morning when he'd brought it from the apartment. He hadn't opened it in front of Ricky yet. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because once he opened it, the shape of this thing became something larger than a repair job, and he wasn't quite ready to look at the full shape yet. I don't know, he said, which was partly true. Bossins. The second vehicle told the same story as the first. F-17 fuse, position confirmed, element blown clean with the same fast failure signature. Dielectric compound residue in the socket housing, same approximate volume, same application pattern. The gateway module on this vehicle was also intact. No secondary damage, no downstream component failure. The network had gone down because the fuse had failed, and the fuse had failed because someone had made sure it would. Adrian documented everything. Photographs, swab samples in labeled bags, written notes cross-referenced against the service records Victoria had sent over. He wrote up a technical summary on the legal pad as he worked, the kind of shorthand that made sense only to him, which he would expand into a formal document later. Ricky ran the diagnostic readout on his tablet and compared it against the first vehicle's data in a split-screen view that he'd set up himself without being asked, which was the kind of initiative that Adrian valued and rarely mentioned. Identical, Ricky said, looking at the split screen. Not similar, identical. The fault code sequence, the timing between codes, the module dropout order. You couldn't get this level of consistency if you tried. He stopped. Well, you could if you tried. You'd have to try deliberately, Adrian confirmed. So the technician, whoever was in the bay with these vehicles, did the same thing to all 8 of them. The same or close enough to produce identical output. They might have varied the compound volume slightly by vehicle, but the target failure window was clearly the same. Ricky set down the tablet and leaned against the lift column. He was quiet for a minute in the way that usually meant he was working something through before he said it. Adrian, does Hargrove know they have someone doing this? It was the question Adrian had been sitting with since 5:30 that morning. He'd built the answer across 2 days of evidence and 4 years of history, and he still didn't like the shape it made. I think some of them do, he said. He opened the manila folder. Ricky read the report standing at the workbench, turning pages slowly. He was a fast reader normally, but he moved through this one carefully, the way you move through something when you understood that the details mattered. Adrian let him read without explaining. The document explained itself. When Ricky finished, he set it down and said nothing for a moment. You wrote this 4 years ago, he said. Spring. I submitted it through the internal system at Meridian Elite. That was the Hargrove subsidiary I worked for at the time. Different name, same parent company. And they fired you. Restructuring. Adrian said the word the way you said something you'd been given to say and didn't believe. 6 weeks after I submitted the report. Ricky looked at the folder, then at the 2 fuse samples in their labeled bags, then back at Adrian. Has anyone else seen this? No. No one? In 4 years? I kept it because I keep documentation. I didn't know what to do with it, and honestly, I told myself I'd misread the situation. That maybe it was coincidence. that maybe the report went into a pile somewhere and just never got processed. He paused. I talked myself out of it. And now? Adrian looked at the evidence laid out on the workbench. 2 fuse samples, 2 sets of socket residue, the diagnostic logs from 8 vehicles, the service records with their impossible timestamps, and a formal technical report from 4 years ago sitting right beside all of it, describing the same fuse, the same failure mode, the same diagnostic presentation. Now I can't talk myself out of it anymore, he said. Ricky crossed his arms and stared at the workbench for a long moment. What does Victoria Langford know so far? She knows the failure is a fuse. She knows the repair is cheap. She doesn't know about the compound residue yet, and she doesn't know about the report. When are you telling her? When I have everything documented. I'm not going to her with half a case. Adrian. Ricky's voice was level, but had something underneath it. Half a case is still better than what she has right now, which is a $194,000 invoice sitting on her desk. She's a client. She deserves to know what she's dealing with. He wasn't wrong. Adrian picked up his phone. Awesome. Victoria arrived at the shop at 3 in the afternoon, which was 40 minutes after Adrian called her and approximately 35 minutes faster than he'd expected. She came alone, which he also hadn't expected. No assistant, no attorney, no colleague. Just Victoria in the same gray coat as before, stepping into the bay and looking around with the same quality of observant stillness she'd shown in the parking structure. She looked at the workbench first, at the evidence laid out there. Tell me, she said. So he told her. All of it. The fuse, the compound residue, the thermal degradation mechanism, the diagnostic presentation it produced. He told her about the second vehicle confirming the first. He told her about the timestamps in the service records, the parts ordered 14 hours before the diagnostic report was completed. He laid it out in order without dramatizing it, the same way he'd have explained a mechanical finding to any client. Clear, sequential, specific. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, one about the residue compound, which she wanted him to explain twice to make sure she had it right, and one about the parts order timeline, which she'd apparently already noticed herself and wanted him to confirm. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the 2 fuse samples in their labeled bags. You said some of this is familiar to you, she said. You said 4 years. Yes. He handed her the manila folder. She read it there, standing at the workbench. It took her about 8 minutes. When she finished, she closed the folder and held it for a moment without setting it down, as if she wasn't sure it was safe to put it anywhere just yet. You were fired 6 weeks after you submitted this, she said. That's correct? And the report disappeared from the system. I have no way to confirm whether it was ever reviewed. I never received acknowledgement of it, and when I tried to follow up, I was told my login credentials had been revoked. Victoria set the folder on the workbench. She looked at it. Her face was controlled, but Adrian had been watching people process difficult information for long enough to read the specific quality of tension around her jaw and the slight deliberate steadiness of her breathing. How many customers? She said quietly. Not a question exactly. More like something she was saying to herself that happened to come out loud. I can't know that without access to their records, Adrian said. But if this has been running since before I submitted the report, and the sophistication suggests it predates my time there, we're not talking about an isolated event. We're talking about a business practice. We're talking about a business practice. The bay was quiet. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck navigated the alley behind the shop, with the slow, careful progress of a large vehicle in a narrow space, and the sound of it moved through the walls and faded. I need to ask you something directly, Victoria said. Go ahead. Are you certain? Not mostly certain. Are you certain that what you're showing me is what you say it is? He respected the question. He'd asked himself the same thing a dozen times since the previous night. I'm certain about the technical evidence, the fuse failure mechanism, the residue compound, the diagnostic presentation. That's not interpretation, that's physical evidence with a clear causal chain. The service record timestamps are documented fact. My report from 4 years ago is documented fact. He paused. What I can't be certain about yet is who made the decision, how far up it went, and how long it's been running. That part requires more information than I have. But the part you can be certain about is enough. Yes, Victoria looked at the folder again. Something moved through her expression. Not fear, he didn't think, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of realizing that the problem you've been handed is larger than the container you brought for it. "All right," she said. "What do you need to finish the technical documentation?" "Access to the remaining 6 vehicles. I want to confirm the F-17 failure on each one. I don't need full inspection time, just enough to pull the fuse and photograph the socket. Maybe 4 hours if I have help. I can get you access tomorrow morning." "Good." She picked up the folder. "Can I keep this?" "I have copies." She tucked it under her arm and looked at him with an expression that was harder to read than her earlier ones. "Adrian, for what it's worth, whatever happened 4 years ago, the fact that you kept this." She stopped, started again. Most people wouldn't have. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the thing that was true. "I kept it because I wasn't sure I was wrong. I'm still not sure I was wrong. I just wasn't sure I was right either." He looked at the workbench. "Now I'm sure." "What?" Victoria left at 4:15. Adrian locked up the shop at 6 and drove home in the kind of cold that made the car's heater work audibly against it, the blower running at full and the windshield fogging at the edges despite the defroster's best effort. He thought about the phone call he was going to have to make. Not to Victoria, not to anyone at Hargrove. He wasn't ready for that, and he wasn't sure that call was his to make. He was thinking about Dennis Marsh, the retired mechanic who'd given Victoria his name. Dennis had spent 20 of his 31 years at various dealerships in the Chicago metro area, and he had the kind of institutional memory that came from that. He knew who worked where, what shops had what reputations, and more importantly, he knew the quiet history that didn't make it into any official record. Adrian had worked with Dennis early in his career, back when he was 24, and learning the trade from someone who treated it with the seriousness it deserved. Dennis had been demanding and occasionally difficult, and had expected a level of precision that Adrian had sometimes found excessive at the time, and had since come to understand was the minimum appropriate standard. He called Dennis from the apartment at 7, eating leftover takeout at the kitchen table while the call rang. Dennis picked up on the 4th ring, which was his custom. He'd once explained to Adrian that he never answered a call before the 4th ring, because if someone couldn't wait 4 rings, they were probably going to be annoying to talk to. Adrian had always suspected this was partially true and partially an excuse to finish whatever he was doing first. "Adrian." Dennis's voice was the same it had always been, unhurried, slightly graveled, with the particular quality of a man who had never felt pressure to fill silence. "Dennis, you gave Victoria Langford my number." "I did. You find anything?" "I found the fuse." A pause. "The F-17? Adrian went still. "You know about the F-17? A longer pause this time, the kind that had weight in it. "I knew a tech about 3 years back," Dennis said carefully, "working in the Hargrove network. He came to me because he didn't know who else to go to. Said he'd noticed something on a cluster of customer vehicles. Same failure mode, same presentation, same repair quote every time. He thought someone was doing it deliberately. He was scared to go internal with it." "What happened to him?" "He left the industry, got a job doing something else." Dennis's voice was measured. "I told him to document everything and find a lawyer. He told me he had a kid on the way and couldn't afford the fight." A pause. "I always felt bad about that." Adrian set down his fork. "Dennis, how many people knew about this?" "Knew? Or suspected?" Dennis's voice had something in it that wasn't quite guilt, but was in the neighborhood. "A lot of people in this industry look at things and choose not to see them, Adrian. You know that. Dealership culture it's complicated. People have mortgages, they have families. They see something wrong and they weigh it against what they have to lose. And most of the time the math doesn't work out in favor of doing anything about it." "But you knew." "I suspected," Dennis said firmly. "I never had what you apparently have now." A pause. "How bad is it?" Adrian told him. He went through the evidence in the same order he'd used with Victoria, but with Dennis he could use the technical shorthand and didn't have to explain the mechanisms. Dennis listened without interrupting except for 2 short sounds of acknowledgement that told Adrian he was following and arriving at the same conclusions. When Adrian finished, Dennis was quiet for a moment. "The report you submitted 4 years ago," Dennis said. That's the critical piece. I know. If they suppressed it, if there's documentation that they received it and buried it, that changes the nature of what this is. I know that too. Adrian? Dennis's voice was careful now, careful in the specific way of someone who knew the territory and wanted to warn about it. I gave Victoria your name because I knew you were the right person to find the truth. But finding the truth and surviving what comes next are two different things. These are not small people. Hargrove Premier has corporate counsel on retainer, and they have relationships in this industry that go back 30 years. If you go at them with this and it doesn't stick, I know. Do you? Adrian looked at the legal pad on the kitchen table, the notes he'd taken, the carefully labeled evidence bags sitting in his shop right now, photographed and documented with the kind of methodical attention that he'd learned from a man who was now telling him to be careful. I know, he said again, but I also have 8 vehicles sitting in a parking structure with the same blown fuse and the same compound residue, and I have a woman who is about to pay $200,000 for parts she doesn't need, and I have a report that went into a system at Hargrove Premier 4 years ago and came out nothing. Dennis didn't say anything. I'm not going at them blind, Adrian continued, and I'm not going at them alone, but I'm going. Another silence. Then Dennis said, You need a good attorney. Victoria has one. Not her attorney, yours. The next morning arrived the way January mornings always did in that city, without ceremony, without warmth, without any particular interest in whether you were ready for it. Adrian was at the shop by 6:30. Ricky came in at 7 with the baby's schedule having cooperated for once, carrying coffee for both of them, and a demeanor that was alertly focused in the way of someone who'd spent the night thinking about something and arrived with conclusions. Victoria had sent word through her assistant that the remaining 6 vehicles would be accessible at the fleet parking structure starting at 8. She'd arranged for a security access pass to be left at the attendant's booth, and she'd cleared a 2-bay section of the structure's lower level for the inspection work. Adrian and Ricky loaded the toolboxes into the van. The specific tools they needed, not everything, because overpacking for a job was a habit Adrian had broken early and maintained since, and drove across the city in the gray morning light. The parking structure was quieter at 8 than it had been at 3 the previous afternoon. The attendant in the booth was a heavy-set man in his 50s named Earl, who handed over the access pass without looking up from whatever he was reading, which Adrian appreciated. He didn't feel like being engaged. They worked through the 6 remaining vehicles in methodical order. Bay 1 to Bay 6, same inspection process on each. Power distribution center open, F17 position located, fuse removed and photographed, socket inspected, residue swab taken, photos documented, notes written on the legal pad that Adrian carried in his jacket pocket. Ricky worked alongside him, running the documentation tablet and managing the evidence bags with the kind of organized efficiency that made the process faster than it would have been alone. All 6 vehicles confirmed, F17 fuse blown in each one. Dielectric compound residue in each socket. The same application pattern, the same approximate volume, the same calculated failure window. 8 vehicles, 8 identical interventions, 8 clean diagnostic presentations designed to look like something they weren't. By 11, they had everything. Ricky loaded the evidence kits into the van while Adrian stood in the lower level of the parking structure and looked at the row of Escalades. 8 vehicles that had never needed what Hargrove said they needed. 8 vehicles that needed a $20 fuse and a socket clean, nothing more. 8 vehicles behind a $200,000 story that someone had been counting on to go unquestioned. You good? Ricky asked, coming back from the van. Yeah, Adrian said, not entirely sure it was true. They drove back to the shop. Adrian spent the afternoon writing the technical report, the full version, formal and precise, with the photographs and the swab data and the cross-referenced diagnostic logs and the timeline documentation from the service records. He was not a fast writer. He wrote slowly and checked each claim against the evidence before he moved to the next one, because a report with a single technical inaccuracy became a report that lawyers could take apart, and he was not going to give anyone that opening. Ricky worked the bay, handling the regular clients whose vehicles had been sitting in the queue while the Escalade investigation occupied the diagnostic equipment. He did it without complaint and without making Adrian feel the weight of it, which was one of the things Adrian valued about him that he also rarely said out loud. At 3:30, his phone rang. Unknown number, different from Victoria's. He answered it. "Is this Adrian Kane?" Male voice. Older, authoritative in the specific way of a man who was accustomed to his voice producing effects. "It is. My name is Gerald Marsh now. No relation to whoever referred you, I'm sure. I'm senior counsel for Hargrove Premier Auto Group. It's come to our attention that you've been conducting inspections on vehicles belonging to Langford Capital Group, and I wanted to reach out directly to make sure we're all clear on a few important things." Adrian said nothing. He waited. "The vehicles in question are under active warranty coverage administered by our service centers. Any unauthorized disassembly or inspection conducted outside our authorized network constitutes a warranty violation under the terms of the original purchase agreement. We want to make sure that's clear before this goes any further." "What terms specifically?" Adrian said. A brief pause. The attorney hadn't expected engagement. "The standard authorized service terms. I'm happy to send them over." "Please do," Adrian said. "Send them to my address. I'll have my attorney review them." He paused a beat. "And while you're at it, you might want to check your own service records for the Langford fleet, specifically the timestamps on the parts orders relative to the diagnostic completion dates. There seems to be a sequencing issue." The silence on the other end was about 2 seconds. Not long, but it was the wrong kind of silence for someone who was supposed to be on firm ground. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," the attorney said. His voice had shifted, not dramatically, but enough. "I'm sure the documentation will clarify it," Adrian said. "Is there anything else?" Another pause. "Mr. Kane, I want to be clear that we're not looking for a confrontation here. We're simply making sure everyone understands the legal framework." "I understand the legal framework," Adrian said. "Thank you for calling." He hung up. He sat at the workbench for a moment with the phone in his hand, feeling the specific quality of having crossed a line you couldn't uncross. Not bad, exactly. Just different. The shape of the situation had changed in the last 90 seconds, and he was standing in a different place than he'd been before the call. Ricky appeared in the bay doorway. Who was that? Hargrove's lawyer. Ricky absorbed this. Already? Someone talked. Adrian set down the phone. Someone at the fleet structure, maybe, or someone Victoria spoke to. Doesn't matter, they know I've been looking at the vehicles. What did he say? Warranty violation, unauthorized inspection, standard warning shot language. And you said? I told him to send the terms to my attorney. Ricky blinked. You don't have an attorney. I know that. Adrian picked up his phone and found the contact Dennis Marsh had texted him that morning before he'd asked for it, because Dennis had anticipated he'd need it before Adrian himself had. A name and number. Someone Dennis trusted, which was the only reference that mattered. I'm getting one, Adrian said. He looked at the completed technical report on his workbench. 61 pages. Fully documented, cross-referenced against 4 years of history that hadn't been history at all. Just evidence waiting for someone to put it in order. He picked up his phone and dialed. The attorney Dennis had referred was a woman named Carol Purcell, and she had an office on the 14th floor of a building on South Wacker that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper and the particular ambition of people who worked in law. She was 61 years old, had spent the first 15 years of her career in commercial litigation and the last 22 in consumer protection and corporate fraud, and she had the kind of face that had stopped pretending to be impressed by things somewhere around 2009 and never started again. She read Adrian's technical report in full on the day he brought it to her. She read it the way she apparently read everything. In silence, without expression, with a mechanical pencil that she held throughout but never used. When she finished, she set it on the desk and looked at him across it. You documented this yourself? She said. Yes. No outside verification. Not yet. The residue compound analysis, you identified it visually and by comparison? Under loop, cross-referenced against product specification sheets I pulled from the manufacturer's website. I'm confident in the identification. An independent lab analysis would confirm it. We'll get one. She tapped the cover page once with the pencil eraser. The report from 4 years ago is the spine of this. Without it, you have evidence of a repair fraud on one corporate client. With it, You have evidence of a systemic practice they were warned about and chose to suppress. She paused. Is there any possibility the original report exists in their system? I don't know. I never received acknowledgement that it was received. But you submitted it through their internal documentation platform. Yes. Which means there may be a server record of the submission even if the document was deleted. Carol Purcell made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite skepticism, but occupied the space between. All right. Before we talk about next steps, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly rather than helpfully. Okay? Is there anything in your history with Hargrove, anything at all, that they could use to characterize your actions here as retaliatory? A termination dispute, an unpaid severance disagreement, any professional conflict that predates this? Adrian had expected the question. He'd been asking himself a version of it for 4 days. They terminated me with a severance package. I accepted it and signed a standard separation agreement. There was no dispute, no legal action. I was frustrated about losing the job, and I've never stopped believing the report was real. But I haven't had any contact with anyone at Hargrove in 4 years. And the separation agreement, do you have a copy? At home. I can get it. Bring it to our next meeting. She folded her hands on the desk. I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy, Adrian. You're an independent mechanic with a 6-year-old shop going against a dealership group that probably has 4 attorneys on staff and another firm on retainer. Gerald Marsh, who called you, I know him. He's not incompetent. He's going to push hard on the warranty violation angle. He's going to push hard on your credibility, and he's going to push hard on the idea that you're running a competing business with a financial interest in undermining Hargrove's service reputation. All of that is technically true, Adrian said. All of that is technically true, she agreed. Which is why the documentation has to be airtight, the lab analysis has to be independent, and the timeline has to be bulletproof. She looked at him. Victoria Langford is your client. She has resources and she has standing. If she's willing to be the lead complainant on this, it changes the weight of what we can do. I can ask her. Ask her today. Us. Victoria said yes before Adrian finished the sentence. They were on the phone for 11 minutes. She'd already spoken to her own legal team about the warranty violation threat, and her attorney had given her the same read that Carol Purcell had given Adrian. The warranty language was ambiguous enough that Hargrove could make noise about it, but unlikely to win on it, particularly given the circumstances. More importantly, Victoria had spent the previous 48 hours doing something Adrian hadn't known she was doing. She'd been quietly contacting other corporate fleet managers in her professional network, asking general questions about Hargrove's service department. 3 of them had similar experiences, she told him. Her voice was steady but had something underneath it, the controlled anger of someone who has found out that what happened to them was not unique, not identical, not the same presentation, but the same pattern, large repair estimates following routine maintenance, expensive parts replacements that were non-negotiable according to the service team. And in 2 of those cases, the customers paid without question. Adrian pressed the phone against his ear. Did they keep the vehicles? One of them, yes. The other switched fleets. I've asked both of them to send me their service records. Victoria. I know, she said. I know what it means. I've been sitting with it since you called me. A pause. My attorney said to stop talking to Hargrove entirely. We're not paying the invoice. That's the right call. Adrian, how long before you can have the full technical package ready? The formal version, something that holds up in a professional setting. He thought about the 61 pages sitting on his workbench, and about Carol Purcell's instruction to add independent lab verification. A week, he said. 10 days if the lab takes longer. I may not have 10 days, Victoria said. Hargrove's CEO has requested a meeting. His assistant called this morning. He wants to sit down with our executive team to address concerns about the service relationship. Adrian said nothing for a moment. Somewhere in the background of Victoria's call, he could hear the ambient sounds of an office, voices, the soft percussion of a keyboard, the close and open of a door. Normal sounds. The sounds of a day that was continuing while this particular situation built towards something that hadn't happened yet. When? He said. Thursday. 4 days. That's not enough time for the lab. I know, but I can delay the meeting, not cancel. That would tip them. Delay it to next Wednesday if I frame it as a scheduling conflict. She paused. Can you be there? At the meeting? The question sat with him for a moment. In what capacity? Technical consultant, my expert witness, for lack of a better term. You know this material better than anyone in that room is going to know it, and I need someone who can answer questions I can't answer. He thought about the parking structure. He thought about 8 Escalades. He thought about Gerald Marsh's careful voice on the phone and the 2-second silence that had followed the mention of timestamp sequences. Yes, he said. I'll be there. Chuts. The lab results came back in 6 days, which was faster than Adrian had expected and slower than he'd hoped. Carol Purcell had sent the residue swabs to an independent materials analysis lab in Evanston that she used regularly for commercial fraud cases, and the report that came back was exactly what Adrian's visual identification had predicted. Dielectric insulating compound, petroleum-based, consistent with commercially available electrical contact protection products, applied to fuse socket contact surfaces in a pattern inconsistent with standard maintenance or incidental transfer. The phrase the lab used in their summary was application pattern and quantity consistent with deliberate placement for purposes of thermal impedance induction. Carol Purcell emailed Adrian the report with a single line of text. This is what we needed. He read the lab summary 4 times at the kitchen table that evening, not because he didn't understand it, he understood it completely, but because there was something about seeing technical evidence confirmed in formal language by an independent party that changed the weight of it in his hands. For 4 days, he'd carried this as something he knew. Now it was something that could be proven. Ricky came by the shop the next morning to help Adrian finalize the technical package. They worked for 3 hours at the workbench, Adrian dictating while Ricky formatted on the laptop, the two of them cross-referencing every claim against the photographic evidence and the lab report and the service record timestamps. By noon, they had a document that Carol Purcell, when Adrian sent it to her that afternoon, described on the phone as cleaner than most things I get from people who've been doing this for 30 years. Adrian didn't feel clean about it. He felt tired and wound up at the same time, which was a combination he associated with situations that were not yet done. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 2. Hargrove Premier's executive suite occupied the 16th floor of their flagship location on North Michigan, and the conference room where the meeting would take place was described in Victoria's assistant's confirmation email as the Meridian Room, which Adrian found darkly appropriate given the subsidiary he'd worked for. He mentioned this to Ricky, who gave him a look that said he'd noticed but that it wasn't funny. Adrian agreed. It wasn't. He wore the best suit he owned, which was a charcoal wool he'd bought 4 years ago for his cousin's wedding and worn exactly twice since. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror Wednesday morning and looked at himself in it and felt the same thing he felt every time he wore it, that he looked like a man wearing a suit rather than a man who wore suits, and that there was nothing to be done about that distinction. He arrived at the Langford Capital offices on West Monroe at 1 o'clock, which was when Victoria had asked him to come so they could review the plan before driving over together. She looked at the suit without commenting, which he also appreciated. Her own attorney was there, a man named Patterson, 50s, silver-haired, the kind of lawyer who had done this exact type of meeting enough times that he moved through the preparation with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had stopped being nervous about rooms like this somewhere around his 3rd decade of practice. He reviewed the technical package with Adrian for 30 minutes, asking questions that were specific and pointed, and told Adrian that he'd already read the material carefully. Carol Purcell had been in contact with Patterson's office for 3 days, and the two of them had apparently developed a coordinated approach that they'd only partially briefed Adrian on, which he found slightly annoying but accepted because that was the nature of working with people who knew things he didn't. "What's their position going to be?" Adrian asked Patterson. "Warranty violation as the lead. They'll argue your inspection voided coverage and created the liability they're now trying to mitigate. Secondary argument will be that the diagnostic findings from their certified team supersede anything an independent technician produces." Patterson looked at the technical package. The lab report complicates both of those arguments significantly. They don't know about the lab report yet. They know we have forensic analysis. They don't have the content. Patterson closed the folder. The report from 4 years ago is the piece they're not prepared for. My expectation is that when you introduce it in that room, there will be a request for a recess. And then? And then we'll see what kind of people they actually are. Victoria was quiet through most of this. She sat at the end of the conference table with her hands folded, listening, and Adrian had the sense that she had made whatever internal decision she needed to make sometime in the previous 48 hours and had arrived this morning on the other side of it. Not calm. She wasn't calm, he didn't think, but settled, which was different. At 1:55, they got in a car and drove to North Michigan. The Meridian Room on the 16th floor of Hargrove Premier's flagship location had floor-to-ceiling windows on the east wall that looked out over the lake, which was frozen gray at the edges in January, and darker water toward the center. The kind of view that was meant to communicate something about scale and permanence. Adrian noticed it the way he noticed things he wasn't supposed to be impressed by, with a brief involuntary acknowledgement followed by a deliberate return to what mattered. The Hargrove side of the table was already seated when they arrived. 3 people. A man Adrian didn't recognize who introduced himself as Richard Hargrove, the current CEO. 60s. Heavy. The carefully cultivated demeanor of a man who had run a family business long enough to believe his own authority was a natural condition. A woman named Diane Cho, described as VP of Service Operations, who had the tight-shouldered posture of someone who had been in a difficult meeting before this one and expected this one to be worse. And Gerald Marsh, the attorney, who nodded at Adrian with the specific neutrality of someone who recognized that the phone call had not gone the way he'd intended. There were 2 other men on the Hargrove side whose names Adrian didn't catch, and whose roles weren't introduced. Associates, probably, or subordinate counsel. They sat slightly back from the table, which told Adrian they were there to listen and document, not to speak. Victoria sat across from Richard Hargrove. Patterson sat beside her. Adrian sat at the end of the Langford side, with his copy of the technical package in front of him and the small sealed evidence bag sitting beside it on the table, containing a single blown F-17 fuse. He'd brought it deliberately. Evidence had a different weight when it was physically present. Richard Hargrove opened the meeting with the practiced ease of a man who was used to opening meetings. Victoria, thank you for making time. I know you've had concerns about the service experience with your fleet, and I want to assure you personally that we take that seriously. Hargrove Premier has built its reputation over 30 years on client trust, and when there's a breakdown in communication— Richard, Victoria's voice was pleasant. I appreciate that. Before we get into the service relationship, I'd like my technical consultant to walk through some findings from the fleet inspection. Adrian? Hargrove looked at Adrian. It was a brief look but had something specific in it, an assessment, a recalibration. Adrian had seen it before, in various versions, the look of a man deciding how much of a problem he was looking at. Of course, Hargrove said. Adrian opened the technical package without preamble. He'd prepared for this the way he prepared for everything. In order, specific, without decoration. He started with the diagnostic baseline, the fault code clusters on all 8 vehicles, the U-code presentation, the surface appearance of systemic network failure. He put the photographs on the table, the fault code readouts, the module communication errors, the warning cluster images that had presumably formed the basis of Hargrove's diagnostic report. This is what the vehicles presented, he said, and I want to be clear. This is an accurate representation of the vehicle state as of the inspection date. The fault codes are real. The module communication failures are real. The network was down. Diane Cho had been watching him with an expression that was working very hard to stay neutral. Marsh was writing something on the pad in front of him. The question, Adrian continued, is why? He put the next set of photographs on the table. Power distribution center, open, F-17 position. Close-up of the blown fuse, close-up of the socket interior showing the residue. Every vehicle in the Langford fleet had a blown communication network supply fuse, F-17 position, power distribution center, driver's side. In each case, the blown fuse took down the gateway module, which created the network communication failure that produced the fault code cluster you see in the diagnostic report. Marsh had stopped writing. His pen was still on the pad. Replacing the fuse and resetting the system on each vehicle resolves the fault code presentation completely, Adrian said. The ECM units are intact. The harness assemblies are intact. There is no catastrophic system damage. There was never any catastrophic system damage. The room was quiet. The lake was visible through the east wall windows, gray and still. That's an interesting theory, Richard Hargrove said. His voice had changed, not dramatically. He was too practiced for that, but it had lost something. It's not a theory, Adrian said. We've confirmed it on 2 of the vehicles. Fuse replacement, system reset, full network restoration. Both vehicles are operational. I have the post-repair diagnostic logs here if you'd like to review them. He put those on the table too. Hargrove looked at Marsh. Marsh was looking at the photographs with an expression Adrian couldn't read cleanly, but that had some of the quality of a man who had just been told something he'd been trying not to find out. The fuse failure itself is potentially explainable, Adrian continued, keeping his voice even. Voltage spikes happen. Single vehicle, single fuse failure, I'd log it as an unfortunate event and move on. But all 8 vehicles, same fuse, same failure window, 72 hours after your service appointment, he paused. That's not a voltage spike. He put the lab report on the table. This is an independent materials analysis of residue samples taken from the F17 fuse socket on each of the 8 vehicles. The residue is dielectric insulating compound, applied to the socket contact surfaces in a pattern and quantity that the lab characterizes as, he read from the report, consistent with deliberate placement for purposes of thermal impedance induction. He looked up. What that means in practical terms is that someone applied a compound to the fuse socket that caused the contact resistance to increase over time, generating heat, degrading the fuse element, and causing the fuse to fail approximately 72 hours after application. Diane Cho's face had gone through something in the last 30 seconds that she hadn't quite managed to keep off it. She was looking at the table now, not at Adrian. Richard Hargrove said, "That's a very serious allegation." "Yes," Adrian said, "it is. And you're suggesting that someone from our service department—" "I'm presenting the physical evidence. What it suggests, I'll leave to the lawyers." Marsh started to speak. "Mr. Kane, I want to note for the record that any findings from an unauthorized inspection conducted outside our certified service—" "Noted," Patterson said pleasantly. "And I'll note for the record that we have a chain of custody document for every evidence sample, independent lab certification for the materials analysis, and pre-inspection photographs showing vehicle condition consistent with no prior third-party access. If you'd like to challenge the evidentiary basis, we're happy to have that conversation in a different venue." Marsh stopped. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and placed the evidence bag on the table. The blown fuse sat inside it, small and flat and absolutely present. He left it there and let the room look at it for a moment. Then he opened the folder that had been sitting under the technical package since the beginning of the meeting. "There's one more thing," he said. He put the 4-year-old report on the table. All 17 pages, the cover sheet on top, the submission date visible in the upper right corner. "This is a formal technical report I submitted to Meridian Elite Service Center in April, 4 years ago. Meridian Elite was operating as a subsidiary of Hargrove Premier at the time." He looked at Richard Hargrove. "The report documents a defect in the F17 communication network supply fuse in the same vehicle line currently in the Langford fleet. It documents the failure mode, the diagnostic presentation, and the mechanism by which a deliberate intervention could produce that failure mode at a predictable interval." He paused. "I submitted this report through your internal documentation system. 6 weeks later, I was terminated. The report was never acknowledged. No audit was conducted. No investigation followed." He looked at Hargrove steadily, and 4 years later, 8 vehicles belonging to a corporate client received exactly the intervention my report described, producing exactly the diagnostic presentation my report predicted, resulting in a repair estimate of $194,000 for parts and labor that were never necessary. The silence in the Meridian room had a specific quality now, not the polished silence of a managed corporate meeting, something rawer than that. Richard Hargrove was looking at the report on the table. His face had the careful stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the results of. Diane Cho spoke without looking up. "Richard, I think we should take a brief recess." "Absolutely not," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet and completely final. "We're not recessing. We're going to sit here and address this." Hargrove looked at her. For the first time in the meeting, the practiced ease was gone. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not guilt exactly. Not yet. But something that was working very hard not to become guilt in front of witnesses. Victoria, he said, I want to be clear that if there was a lapse in our service process, a lapse, she repeated, if something occurred in our service department that was unauthorized, Richard, her voice was still quiet. It was worse when it was quiet. I have a $200,000 invoice on my desk. I have 8 vehicles with fuses that were deliberately compromised. I have a technical report your company received 4 years ago and buried, and the man who wrote it sitting across this table after you fired him 6 weeks later. She looked at him. What would you like to call it? The room absorbed that. Marsh was very still. Diane Cho had a quality about her that Adrian had seen before in people who were sitting in a room when a thing they'd known about came fully into the light. A kind of sick, held breath waiting. I'd like to call it something we investigate thoroughly, Hargrove said. His voice had changed again. The authority was still there, but it was working for itself now, working to find a position, an angle, something to stand on. And if we find that something improper occurred, we will address it fully. You have my personal commitment to that. Your commitment, Patterson said pleasantly, is noted. We'll also need, in writing by Friday, a preservation hold on all service records, internal communications, and personnel files related to the Langford Fleet Service appointment, as well as all records from the Meridian Elite subsidiary going back 5 years. If that documentation is altered or destroyed after this meeting, we'll treat it as evidence of consciousness of guilt and act accordingly. Marsh started to respond. Stopped. Wrote something on his pad instead. Additionally, Patterson continued, we'll need confirmation that the remaining 6 vehicles in the Langford fleet will be repaired at no cost using the correct parts, which is to say, the fuse replacements Mr. Kane has specified, within the next 72 hours. And the invoice, Victoria said, I want it withdrawn. Today. Hargrove looked at Marsh. The exchange between them was brief and didn't involve words, which told Adrian more than words would have. We can agree to the repair, Hargrove said. The invoice question and the record preservation are matters our legal team will need to respond to formally. By Friday, Patterson said, or we file Monday. The meeting ended 40 minutes later without resolution and without explosion, which was more or less what Patterson had told them to expect. Resolution didn't happen in rooms like that. Resolution happened afterward, in the quiet of people doing the arithmetic of their own exposure and deciding what it cost to fight versus what it cost to settle. Adrian had understood this intellectually. Sitting in the room and watching it happen was something else. They rode down in the elevator in silence. Victoria, Patterson, Adrian. The lobby of the building was marble and warm after the meeting room's climate-controlled chill, and the afternoon light was coming through the front glass at a low angle that caught dust in the air and made it visible. Outside on Michigan Avenue, the January wind found them immediately, the way it always did on that particular street. Victoria pulled her coat closed and stood for a moment before saying anything. That was him, she said. Not a question. Hargroves? Adrian said. No. She looked at the building. Marsh, when you put the lab report on the table, he knew. He already knew what it was going to say. Adrian had noticed the same thing, the pen going still, the specific quality of Marsh's silence. Marsh is a lawyer. He might have been briefed on what we had. He might have, she said, or he might have helped them decide what to do with your report 4 years ago. She said it flatly, without drama, the way you said something you'd been thinking about for a while and had decided was probably true. Then she looked at Adrian. You were right, about all of it. He didn't feel the satisfaction he might have expected from that. Mostly he felt tired and something else that he couldn't name cleanly. The weight of having been right about something for 4 years without being able to do anything about it, and now suddenly being able to, and discovering that the ability came with its own kind of heaviness. We'll see what Friday brings, he said. Victoria nodded. Then she said, Adrian, the man who came to Dennis 3 years ago, the technician. Dennis told you about him? He mentioned it. Do you know who he was? No name. Dennis said he left the industry. She was quiet for a moment. The traffic on Michigan Avenue moved past them with the usual indifference of city traffic. I hope he finds out, she said, that someone finally did something about it. Adrian thought about that on the drive back to the shop. He thought about the tech who'd gone to Dennis 3 years ago with what he'd found, and left with a mortgage and a family and a calculation that hadn't worked out in favor of pushing harder. He thought about how many other people had done the same calculation in the years between his report and today. All the customers who'd paid the estimate without question. All the technicians who'd applied the compound and told themselves it was someone else's decision. All the quiet accumulation of a system that worked because no one stopped it. He was almost back to the shop when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it. Mr. Kane. Female voice. He didn't recognize it. Careful, low, the voice of someone calling from somewhere they didn't want to be overheard. My name is Sandra Okafor. I work in service operations at Hargrove Premier. I was in the building today. Adrian pulled into a parking space without thinking about it, the muscle memory of finding a spot while handling something else. I heard about the meeting, the woman said. I've been wanting to talk to someone for a long time. A pause. Short, but loaded. I have emails, internal communications from about 3 years back, between senior management and the service director, about a program they were calling Internal Efficiency Optimization. Adrian said nothing. He let her continue. The emails discuss the F-17 fuse specifically. They discuss the compound application. They discuss customer diagnostic presentations and how to document them for insurance and warranty recovery. Her voice was steady, but had something underneath it. Not quite fear. Something closer to relief, which was its own kind of evidence. They discussed the report that was submitted by a technician at Meridian Elite and what to do about it. Adrian's hand tightened slightly on the phone. Ms. Okafor, before you say anything else, I want you to be careful about this. Have you spoken to an attorney? Not yet. You should do that before you talk to me. What you're describing, if you share it through the wrong channel, it could be used against you before it helps anyone. A pause. I know the risk. I know you know it. I'm asking you to protect yourself before you try to help anyone else. He thought for a moment. I'm going to give you a name. Carol Purcell. She's a consumer protection attorney in the city. She's already involved in this matter, and she'll know how to handle what you have in a way that keeps you covered. He gave her the number. Call her tonight if you can. Tell her Adrian sent you. And if I do that, the woman started. Then what you have gets used the right way, Adrian said. That's the only thing I can promise you. A longer pause this time. He heard her breathing on the other end, and behind it, the faint ambient sound of an office building. The specific white noise of a large interior space. She was still there, still deciding. All right, she said finally. I'll call her. Tonight, he said. Tonight. She hung up. Adrian sat in the parked car on the side street, half a block from his shop, and looked at the steering wheel for a moment. The late afternoon light had gone flat and gray the way it did before dark in January, everything losing its edges and contrast an hour before the sun actually went down. He sat there for another minute. Then he got out of the car, pulled his coat against the cold, and walked back to work. Sandra Okafor called Carol Purcell at 8:47 that Wednesday evening, which Adrian knew because Carol texted him at 9:15 with 4 words. She called. We're meeting tomorrow. He read the text standing at the kitchen sink, eating cold rice out of a container because he'd forgotten to heat it and hadn't noticed until halfway through. He read it twice, set the phone face down on the counter, and finished the rice. Then he stood at the window for a while and watched the street below, where a city bus moved through the intersection under the yellow wash of the streetlights, and a man in a heavy coat walked a dog that appeared to want to go somewhere other than where they were going. He thought about what Sandra Okafor had described on the phone. Internal emails, senior management, a program with a name, Internal Efficiency Optimization. That was the kind of bureaucratic language that existed specifically to make something look like something else. He thought about the timeline. If the emails went back 3 years, and his report had been submitted 4 years ago, then someone had made a decision in the window between those two events. Someone had read what he wrote, understood what it meant, and decided to turn it into a revenue model instead of a liability. That was the part he kept returning to, not the fraud itself. Fraud was explicable, if not excusable. People made bad calculations under financial pressure. People rationalized. What he kept returning to was the decision point, the moment someone read his report and thought, this is useful, and then made sure Adrian Kane was no longer in a position to ask what happened to it. He washed the container, dried it, put it away. Went to bed at 11. Slept badly, the way he'd been sleeping all week, and woke at 5:15 to a gray ceiling and the sound of a garbage truck working the alley 3 buildings down. Boa. Carol's meeting with Sandra Okafor lasted 4 hours, which Carol relayed to Adrian in a call Thursday afternoon in the clipped, precise language she used when she was assembling something in her head while she talked. "She's a service operations coordinator," Carol said. "She's been at Hargrove Premier 11 years. She has access to internal communications going back to her first year, which she retained on a personal archive drive she kept because she's the kind of person who keeps documentation." A pause. "You would like her." "What are the emails?" 43 internal messages spanning a period from roughly 3.5 years ago to about 14 months ago. The chain involves Marcus Shaw, he's the senior director of service operations, and 2 other individuals whose identities we're still clarifying. The emails discuss, and I'm going to use the language from the documents, the optimization of diagnostic recommendations to maximize parts and labor revenue in low-scrutiny fleet and commercial accounts. Adrian said nothing. "There are specific references to the F-17 fuse mechanism," Carol continued. "Shaw refers to it as the reliability window approach in 2 separate messages. There are revenue projections. There are discussion of customer profiles, specifically targeting fleet accounts where a large invoice would be processed by a finance department rather than reviewed by a technical decision maker. They profiled the customers. They selected for accounts where a $200,000 invoice would go through accounts payable without someone asking whether it made mechanical sense." Carol's voice was even, but Adrian had spoken to her enough times now to hear what was underneath it. There is also one email, sent approximately 4 years and 2 months ago, discussing a technical report submitted by a Meridian Elite employee and the recommended response. The kitchen was very quiet. "The recommended response," Adrian said. "Shaw's language is careful. He doesn't say suppress or destroy. He says the documentation should be allowed to expire through the standard archival process, and the submitting employee's position should be evaluated for redundancy, given the current restructuring initiative." Carol paused. "Evaluated for redundancy. That was you." Adrian sat down at the kitchen table. He hadn't meant to sit down. His legs just made the decision independently. "Adrian," Carol's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more direct. "This is what we needed. Between your technical report, the lab analysis, the service record timestamps, and these emails, we have a documented pattern that goes back 4 years, involves deliberate suppression of a safety-related disclosure, and caused quantifiable financial harm to at least one corporate client and potentially dozens of others." She paused. "I've already been in contact with the Illinois Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. They want everything we have by Monday." "The AG's office," he said. "This is bigger than a civil complaint, Adrian. What the emails describe is systematic consumer fraud. That's a regulatory matter and potentially a criminal one. The AG's office has investigative resources we don't have. Subpoena power, the ability to compel Hargrove's complete records, the capacity to identify every customer account that was subjected to this practice." He thought about Victoria's phrase from 3 days ago, "How many customers?" He thought about Dennis's tech 3 years ago, with a kid on the way and a mortgage and a calculation that hadn't worked. He thought about all the accounts payable departments at all the fleet companies that had processed the invoices without questioning them because $200,000 was a line item, not a conversation. "Okay," he said. "Monday," Carol confirmed. "I need your report, the lab analysis, and the original 4-year-old submission in a consolidated package. Can you have it to me by Sunday?" "Yes." "Good." A brief pause. "One more thing. Friday's deadline from Patterson. Hargrove hasn't responded." "At all?" "Their counsel sent a holding letter at 4:59 requesting an extension of the deadline to the following Wednesday. Patterson rejected the extension. If they don't respond with the record preservation confirmation and the invoice withdrawal by close of business Friday, we file Monday alongside the AG referral." "They're stalling." "They're doing the math," Carol said, "which means they're starting to understand the size of what they're looking at." A pause. "How are you doing?" The question came out of the rhythm of the conversation at a slightly different angle, and it caught him off guard. He thought about how to answer it honestly without making it complicated. "I'm okay. he said. "I'll be better when it's done." "It won't be done for a while," she said, not unkindly. "These things move slowly once they go institutional. But the active part, the part where you're the only person who knows what you know, that part is almost done." He held on to that for a moment after they hung up. Friday came and went without a response from Hargrove's counsel. Patterson filed Monday morning. Carroll submitted the package to the AG's office at 10:15. By noon, Adrian had received 3 phone calls from numbers he didn't recognize, which he didn't answer, and a text from Victoria that said simply, "It's done. Thank you." He was in the Bay when the text came in, working on a brake job for a regular client, a school teacher named Mrs. Park, who drove a 12-year-old Camry with 211,000 miles on it and brought Adrian cookies every Christmas in a tin she'd had for 30 years. He was replacing the rear calipers when the text arrived, and he read it with grease on his hands and set the phone back on the shelf above the bay and went back to work. Ricky appeared at the bay door around 1 o'clock with sandwiches from the place 2 blocks down that did a decent Italian beef, and they ate standing at the workbench the way they usually did when the day didn't leave time for sitting. "A G's office is involved now," Ricky said. It wasn't a question. Adrian had briefed him that morning. As of this morning, Ricky worked on his sandwich. "So what happens now?" "Investigation. Hargrove has to produce their records. The AG's team will go through the service history and identify every account that got hit with the same pattern." He looked at the workbench. "It'll take months, probably." "And Hargrove?" "They'll fight it. Their lawyers will fight it. They'll dispute the lab analysis. They'll challenge the email authentication. They'll argue scope and jurisdiction and anything else they can find." He paused. "But the emails with Shaw's name on them are going to be very hard to argue around." "What about Shaw?" Adrian thought about what Carroll had told him, that Marcus Shaw was the senior director of service operations, that his name appeared on the emails describing the practice, that his phrasing had been careful in the way of someone who understood that written language could be read later by people who weren't intended to read it. "That's above my pay grade," Adrian said. Ricky nodded and finished his sandwich. Then, after a moment, "You should feel good about this." "I will," Adrian said, "when it's further along." "You always do that." "Do what?" "Hold off on letting anything land until it's completely finished." Ricky looked at him. "It's not a bad quality. I'm just saying, what you did here is real. The lab report, the documentation, the meeting. You walked into a room with a fuse and a plastic bag and took apart a $200,000 story. That's not nothing." Adrian looked at the Italian beef wrapper on the workbench for a moment. "There's a tech out there who went to Dennis 3 years ago and couldn't push it. There are customers who paid invoices they never should have been sent." He shook his head slightly. "I don't feel good about it yet." "Maybe I will." Ricky accepted this without arguing. It was one of the things Adrian valued about him. The call came on a Tuesday, 10 days after the filing. Not from Carroll or Patterson or Victoria. From a number Adrian almost recognized, a 312 area code, a prefix that nagged at him. And he answered it with the particular attention he'd started paying to calls since this had started. "Mr. Kane." Female voice. Composed. Direct. Different from Victoria's precision, different from Carroll's economy. Something else. "My name is Claudia Bennett. I was appointed CEO of Hargrove Premier Auto Group 8 days ago." Adrian moved to his office and closed the bay door behind him. He sat in the chair at his desk, the one that had a loose wheel he kept meaning to replace, and said, "Ms. Bennett, I want to be clear from the start that I'm calling you personally, not through counsel. I've asked our legal team to give me the room on this one conversation, which they were not happy about." A brief pause that had something dry in it. "They were not happy about a number of things I've done in the last 8 days. What happened to Richard Hargrove?" "He resigned 7 days ago. The board moved quickly once they understood the scope of what the investigation was uncovering, and Richard," she paused, choosing the word, "agreed that new leadership was appropriate given the circumstances." Adrian said nothing. He waited. "I've been in this industry for 22 years, Claudia Bennett said. I came up through finance and operations at 3 different dealer groups, and I've been brought in twice before to clean up situations that previous leadership made worse by not looking at them clearly. Her voice was direct without being aggressive. When I arrived at Hargrove and started going through the service records, I found that the parts for your client's fleet had been ordered before the diagnostic was complete. I found that pattern in 17 other accounts over the past 4 years. She stopped. 17, Mr. Kane. In some of those cases, multiple service events over multiple years. The number sat in the room. 17 accounts. Adrian thought about the math, the number of invoices, the average amount, the years of accumulated billing for work that was never necessary. We're cooperating fully with the AG's investigation, Bennett continued. We're producing every record they've requested. We're not disputing scope or challenging the subpoenas. I've brought in an external auditor to go through the complete service history going back 5 years, and the results of that audit will be provided to the AG's office as they become available. And Marcus Shaw, Adrian said. Marcus Shaw was removed from his position 10 days ago, the day I arrived. He's been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's findings, and I've been advised by counsel that I can't comment further on his status. She paused. What I can tell you is that he will not be returning to a role in this company. Adrian looked at the wall of his office, where a tire pressure specification chart he'd meant to replace for 2 years was still hanging, slightly crooked. Ms. Bennett, I have to ask why you're calling me directly. The legal process is in motion. The AG's office is involved. You have attorneys and Patterson has attorneys. What does this conversation accomplish? A brief pause. Honestly, not much legally. My counsel would agree with you. Another pause. I'm calling because I read the report you submitted 4 years ago, the original one to Meridian Elite. We found it in the server archive. It hadn't been deleted, just moved to a folder structure that effectively buried it. She let that land for a moment. The report is very good. It's thorough, it's precise, and it would have stopped this if anyone had acted on it. Adrian held the phone and said nothing. I can't undo what happened to your career at Meridian Elite, she said. I can't undo the 4 years between your report and now. I'm not going to pretend that an apology from me covers what this situation cost you, because it doesn't. She paused. But I wanted you to know that I read it, and I wanted you to hear from me directly that what was done to that report, and to you, was wrong. The loose wheel on the office chair shifted slightly as Adrian adjusted his weight, the familiar wobble of the thing he kept meaning to fix. He thought about 4 years ago, the morning he'd been called into the manager's office, the careful language about restructuring and consolidation, and the severance package that was slightly better than expected. The walk to his car with a box of his desk items, and the particular hollow feeling of a situation that didn't make sense yet. He'd been 37, he'd had the shop for 2 years, but it wasn't solid yet. It was surviving, which was different from solid, and losing the Meridian job had put a year of difficulty onto a situation that was already difficult. He'd told himself the shop would either make it or it wouldn't, and he'd worked the hours that answered the question. As Bennett, he said, what are you doing about the customers? Every account identified in the audit that shows evidence of the practice is being contacted. We're offering full refunds of the fraudulent charges, plus interest, plus a goodwill payment that our counsel and the AG's office are working to standardize. She paused. It's not enough. I know it's not enough, but it's what we can do. The Langford invoice. Withdrawn. The vehicles will be repaired at our cost using the correct specification, the fuse replacement your report describes. We've already arranged to have a certified technician handle the work under your supervision if you're willing. He thought about that. Under my supervision. You identified the failure. The repair protocol is yours. I'd like it done correctly, and I'd like it documented correctly. A brief pause. Also, frankly, I'd like it done in a way that Victoria Langford can verify, because she deserves to see this closed by the person who opened it. Adrian thought about Victoria standing on Michigan Avenue in the January wind saying, I hope he finds out. All right, he said. Set it up. Okay. The repairs took 2 days. Adrian and Ricky drove to the Langford Fleet facility on a Thursday morning with a case of F-17 maxi fuses and the documentation protocol Adrian had written out the previous evening. Photograph before, fuse removal, socket cleaning, new fuse installation, system reset, post-repair diagnostic log, photograph after. 8 vehicles, same process. Each one documented the way the original inspection had been documented. Thoroughly, in order, without shortcuts. Hargrove sent a technician, a young woman named Kim, who had 6 years in the trade and the watchful, slightly uncomfortable manner of someone who had been briefed carefully about the context of this particular job and was trying to be professional about being observed. She did good work. Adrian told her so on the second vehicle, and she relaxed slightly, and the day went more smoothly after that. Victoria came to the facility at noon and walked through the progress with Adrian while Ricky and Kim worked the fifth vehicle. "6 down," she said, looking at the row of Escalades. "2 more this afternoon." She walked with him between the vehicles, her heels on the concrete parking structure floor making the only sound for a moment. The AG's office called Patterson yesterday. They've identified 4 other corporate accounts with similar billing patterns. 2 of them have already been contacted. Carol told me. "This is going to be a long process," Victoria said. "The audit, the refunds, the regulatory proceedings." She paused. "I keep thinking about the accounts that didn't have someone like you looking at the vehicles." "Most of them didn't," he said. "No." She was quiet for a moment. "And they paid." He didn't have an answer for that. The truth was that most of them had paid, and the money was gone, and the regulatory process would recover what it could recover and leave the rest in the category of things that happened and couldn't be fully undone. That was the reality of it, and it sat badly, and he'd been sitting with it for 2 weeks. "It stops now, though," Ricky said from under the hood of Vehicle 5, not looking up. "That's something." Victoria looked at the back of his head. "Yes," she said. "It is." The news broke on a Friday, 3 weeks after the AG filing. Adrian heard about it from Dennis Marsh, who called at 7 in the morning while Adrian was opening the shop, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who had been right about something for a long time and was now watching it be confirmed in public, which was not quite satisfaction and not quite vindication, but somewhere between the two. "It's on the business section front," Dennis said. A G's office put out a statement. Hargrove Premier, systemic consumer fraud, ongoing investigation, 17 corporate accounts identified. They named Shaw specifically. "I saw," Adrian said. He'd seen the alert on his phone at 6:42 and had spent the next 20 minutes reading every version of the story he could find before leaving for the shop. "How are you feeling?" He thought about it. "Tired." Dennis made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's honest." "I'm glad it's out. I'm glad people know." He unlocked the shop door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of the place settling around him. Oil, concrete, cold metal, the particular atmosphere of a space that did real work. "I keep thinking about your guy, the tech who came to you 3 years ago." Dennis was quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to find him," he said. "I reached out to a few people. Nobody knows where he ended up. If you find him, tell him." "I will." A pause. "Adrian, I referred Victoria to you because I knew you were the right person. But I want to be clear. What you did with it, that was yours. I gave her a name. You built the case." Adrian looked at the bay. The 2 Escalades that had started this were long gone back to the fleet facility, repaired, operational, documented. The bay was occupied by a Subaru with a transmission issue and a pickup truck whose owner had described the problem as "it makes a sound," and left it at that. Normal work. The ordinary texture of days. "Dennis?" he said. "Thank you for trusting me with it." "Don't thank me," Dennis said. "Just keep doing what you do." Marcus Shaw's name stayed in the news for 2 weeks. The stories that followed the initial AG announcement built a portrait that was, in its way, less dramatic than Adrian had expected and more depressing. Shaw had been at Hargrove Premier for 14 years. He'd risen through the service department in the conventional way. Technician, service advisor, service manager, director. He had a house in the suburbs and 2 kids in high school, and by all available accounts, had been considered a capable, if demanding, manager. The profile of a man who had made a series of decisions that were each individually explainable and collectively catastrophic, and who had apparently not experienced the particular moment of clarity that comes from standing outside your own choices and looking at them honestly. Adrian thought about this more than he expected to. He wasn't sure why. Shaw wasn't a sympathetic figure. The emails were clear about what he'd known and what he'd decided, and the careful bureaucratic language of evaluation for redundancy, applied to a technician who'd submitted an inconvenient report, told you something specific about the man who wrote it. But there was something about the mundane normalcy of the portrait, the suburb, the kids, the 14 years of slow escalation, that Adrian found harder to set aside than a more dramatic version of villainy would have been. Bad decisions accumulated quietly. That was the thing. They didn't announce themselves. You made one, and it worked out. And the next one was a little easier, and somewhere in the accumulation you became someone you might not have recognized from an earlier vantage point. Adrian didn't excuse it, but he understood the mechanism, which was different from excusing it, and the mechanism depressed him in a way he couldn't entirely explain. He mentioned this to Ricky one evening when they were closing up the shop, not as an analysis, but just as something he was carrying that had gotten heavy. Ricky listened and then said, "You know what the difference is between Shaw and you?" Adrian looked at him. "You found the same thing he did," Ricky said, 4 years ago. "You found the fuse, you found the mechanism, you understood what it could do. You wrote a report about it. Shaw found it too, at some point, or someone brought it to him, and he thought about what it could do, and he built something different." Ricky shrugged. "Same information, 2 different decisions. That's the whole story." Adrian thought about that for a while. It was simpler than the version in his head and probably more accurate. "You're getting philosophical in your old age," he said. "I'm 24, Ricky said. "I don't have an old age yet." Check. The formal regulatory proceedings against Hargrove Premier began 6 weeks after the AG filing. Carol Purcell called Adrian the morning the notice was issued and walked him through what to expect. A process that would take the better part of a year, involve depositions from multiple parties, including Adrian himself, and result in civil penalties and a structured remediation plan that the AG's office and Hargrove's new leadership were already beginning to negotiate the framework for. Claudia Bennett had, by all available accounts, been doing exactly what she'd told Adrian she would do. The external audit was proceeding. The customer notification and refund program had been formalized. The service operations protocols at Hargrove's flagship locations had been overhauled, with new diagnostic documentation requirements and a mandatory second sign review on any estimate exceeding $50,000. These were not redemptive gestures. They were operational corrections made under regulatory pressure and the very real threat of penalties that made compliance cheaper than resistance. Adrian understood the distinction and didn't romanticize it, but the corrections were real, and their effects would be real, and that was worth something even if the motivation behind them was entirely practical. Sandra Okafor had been placed on paid administrative leave by Hargrove pending the investigation, which was the company's position, that her status was protected while her cooperation with the AG's office was ongoing. Whether she'd have a job when it was over was a question Carol considered unresolved and Adrian considered unlikely, regardless of what the legal framework said about whistleblower protection. He thought about that more than he probably should have. Sandra had called him from a building she was still working in, from a job she was still doing, and handed over emails that ended careers because she'd been carrying the weight of them for 3 years and had finally found someone worth handing them to. She deserved better than a legal protection clause and an uncertain employment status. He mentioned this to Carol, who said, "I know," with the specific tone of someone who had been working in this area long enough to have made peace with the limits of what the law could do for the people who made it work. He wasn't at peace with it, but he was learning to hold it alongside the things that had gone right, which was probably the best he was going to manage. On a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the formal proceedings began, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize, different area code out of state. He answered it. "Is this Adrian Kane?" Male voice, younger than he'd expected from an unknown call, something familiar in the hesitation before the name. "It is. My name is Jerome Watts. I don't know if Dennis Marsh told you. I'm the tech who went to him about 3 years ago. About Hargrove." Adrian sat down on his rolling stool. "Jerome, I've been following the news. I wanted..." A pause, the brief reorganization of someone who'd had a speech prepared and decided it wasn't right. "I wanted to say thank you. I know that sounds..." "No," Adrian said. "It doesn't." A moment of quiet on the line. "I left the industry," Jerome said. "After I talked to Dennis, I I couldn't stay in it and keep knowing what I knew without doing anything about it. So I left. I do HVAC now. It's different work. He paused. I have 2 kids. I couldn't take the risk. I know, Adrian said. I should have pushed harder. You did what you could do at the time you could do it. Adrian meant it and tried to make sure it came through as meant rather than as comfort. What I did, I had the shop. I had the documentation. And I had a client with resources who was willing to fight. That changes the math. Still, Jerome's voice was quiet. It's been 3 years. I've been thinking about those customers the whole time. Me too, Adrian said. Another pause. Are they going to get their money back? The identified accounts, yes. The refund program is in place. Adrian paused. It won't be all of them. Some of them we'll never find, or the records won't be clear enough, but the ones we know about, yes. Jerome was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Not resolved, not satisfied, just something finding a place to rest. Okay. They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular. HVAC, the Chicago cold, the difference between diagnostic work on vehicles and diagnostic work on building systems, which Jerome said was more similar than you'd expect. Then Jerome said he had to get back to a job site, and Adrian said he understood, and there was a brief moment before they hung up where neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was probably the right way to handle it. After the call, Adrian sat in the office for a minute with the phone in his hand and the late afternoon light coming through the smudged window that looked out over the bay, where Ricky was working the Subaru transmission with the particular focused intensity he brought to things he found genuinely interesting. The story wasn't finished. The legal proceedings would run for months. The audit would find what it found. The remediation would do what remediation did, which was approximate justice rather than deliberate. Shaw would face whatever he faced, and Bennett would try to build something that deserved to survive. And somewhere in the paperwork, a $194,000 invoice would be marked void. None of it was finished. But something had shifted in the last hour that Adrian couldn't name precisely. Something about Jerome's voice, or the specific quality of that quiet okay, or just the cumulative weight of the past 6 weeks finally finding somewhere to settle. He got up, went back to the bay, and went to work. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did. Grudgingly, in stages, with false starts that made you put the heavy coat back on twice after you'd already decided you were done with it. By March, the snow was mostly gone from the sidewalks, but still holding on in the shaded corners of parking structures and the north-facing sides of buildings, gray and compressed and stubborn. By April, the city had made its peace with warmth, and the lake had shifted from iron to something that occasionally looked blue, and people walked differently, less braced, less hunched against the cold, with the particular looseness of a city that had survived another winter and knew it. Adrian noticed it more than usual that year. He wasn't sure why, except that the winter had been the kind that marked you, and the end of it felt more specific than it usually did. The shop was busy. It had been busy since February, which was unusual. Winter was typically the slower season, the months when people deferred non-essential work and held on to their money in the cautious way of people who'd grown up in climates where January could surprise you with expenses you hadn't planned for. But something had shifted in the previous 3 months. Something Adrian noticed in the volume of calls and the number of new names in the appointment book, and the way people mentioned, when they came in, that someone had referred them. He didn't track referrals formally. He'd never had enough of them to need to. He asked when he thought to, and the answers varied. A neighbor, a colleague, someone in their building's parking structure who'd overheard a conversation. Occasionally, someone mentioned seeing his name in a news article, which still felt strange to him. The idea of his name appearing in print in a context that wasn't a business directory or a parts supplier invoice. The AG's investigation had been covered in 3 separate articles in the business section of 2 Chicago papers, and in each one, Adrian's name appeared in the same general vicinity as the words independent mechanic and forensic technical report and 4-year-old disclosure. And he'd read each article with the specific discomfort of a private person seeing his private decisions described in the past tense by people who hadn't been there. The articles weren't inaccurate. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that they were partial. They captured the shape of what had happened without the texture of it, without the cold bay and the rolling stool and the legal pad and the 5:30 mornings when he was trying to talk himself out of what he already knew. But people read the articles, and apparently some of them called. Ricky had noticed the volume increase before Adrian mentioned it. He'd started keeping a better log of the appointment book in February, adding a column for referral source that Adrian hadn't asked for, and one morning in March, he'd put the log on the workbench and said, "You should look at this." Adrian had looked. 40% of new appointments in the previous 6 weeks had come through word-of-mouth referrals from clients who'd come in specifically because of the Hargrove situation. He'd stood at the workbench and looked at the column Ricky had added and felt something he couldn't immediately name. "That's significant," he said, which was not what he meant, but was as close as he could get to it in the moment. "It's more than significant," Ricky said. "It's a different shop than we had in October." He wasn't wrong. It was a different shop. The revenue was different, the schedule was different, the phone was busier and the bay was fuller, and Adrian had started having conversations with himself about whether the space was adequate that he'd never had to have before. He'd had those conversations with himself first, and then, cautiously, with Ricky, and then with a small business advisor that Carol Purcell had mentioned in passing as someone she referred to clients who needed financial clarity on growth decisions. The advisor was a man named George Tron, who had the patient, unimpressible manner of someone who had sat across from a lot of people who thought their situation was unique and had come to understand that most situations rhymed. He'd looked at Adrian's numbers for 40 minutes, asked 12 questions, and said, "You need another bay and another technician. The only question is whether you want to do it now or in a year when you'll wish you'd done it in the spring." Adrian had done it in the spring. The new bay was the storage space adjacent to the existing shop. He'd been using it for overflow parts and equipment, which he moved into a rented storage unit 3 blocks away. The build-out took 6 weeks and cost more than the estimate, which George Tron had predicted with the matter-of-fact accuracy of someone who had learned to add 20% to every contractor's number on principle. By the first week of April, the new bay had a lift installed, a separate diagnostic station, and its own workbench, and it smelled like fresh paint over old concrete in a way that Adrian found unexpectedly satisfying. He'd hired a technician named Priya Osman, who had 8 years of dealership experience and had left her last job for reasons she'd described in the interview as cultural, which Adrian understood to mean the particular atmosphere of a service department where the pressure to move tickets fast competed with the professional obligation to move them right, and where that competition had been resolved in the wrong direction once too often. She was meticulous in a way that Adrian recognized, the kind of technician who took 3 times as long on a diagnostic as someone less careful, but produced a result you could stake your reputation on. He'd told her that in the interview, and she'd said, "That's what I'm hoping for," and he'd offered her the job before the conversation was finished. Ricky had welcomed her with the wariness of someone whose territory was being expanded into and the genuine professional respect of someone who recognized competence when it was standing next to him, which resolved itself within the first 2 weeks into a working dynamic that functioned well without requiring any particular management from Adrian. The 3 of them were in the bays on a Thursday afternoon when Victoria Langford called. He stepped out to the alley to take it, the spring afternoon cool enough to require a jacket, but warm enough to make you feel the coming of something better. Victoria's voice had the quality it always had, precise, direct, but with a register underneath it that he'd come to recognize as warmth, which he didn't produce easily, and so he'd learned to notice when it was there. "I wanted to call before the formal notification came through," she said. "The board approved the contract this morning." He'd known it was coming. They'd discussed it in February. A corporate fleet service contract for the Langford Capital Group. All 12 vehicles in their current fleet plus any additions over the following 2 years, with Kane Automotive as the exclusive independent service provider. It was not a small contract. He'd had Carol look at the terms, which was something he'd never needed to do with a service agreement before, and Carol had looked at them and said they were straightforward and fair, and that Victoria had clearly instructed her people not to complicate them. "Thank you, Victoria." "Don't thank me. It's the right business decision." A pause. "How's the new bay?" "Operational as of last week." "And the new hire?" "She's good. She's very good." "Good." Another pause, this one slightly different in quality. The pause of someone who has something else to say and is deciding whether to say it. I spoke to Claudia Bennett yesterday. The remediation fund disbursement started last week. 22 accounts have received full refunds plus the goodwill payments. 3 more are pending documentation verification. 22, Adrian said, with more to follow as the audit completes the remaining account reviews. Victoria's voice was measured. It's not complete restitution. Some of those accounts go back far enough that the statute of limitations limits what the remediation program can recover. But the identified amounts, she paused, it's substantial, more than $2 million in fraudulent billing across the identified accounts. $2 million. Distributed across 17 accounts over 4 years, it worked out to an average per account that was not individually catastrophic, not the kind of number that destroyed a company's finances, the kind of number that went through accounts payable as a line item, the kind of number that no individual decision-maker at any of those companies had probably ever stopped to question because it arrived with a certified technician's signature and a diagnostic report and the implied authority of a name-brand dealership service department. That was how it had worked. Not dramatically, quietly, in the ordinary flow of corporate billing, in the spaces between attention. "How is Sandra Okafor?" Adrian asked. A brief pause. "She's at a different company, operations management role at a fleet logistics firm. She started 3 weeks ago." He felt something release slightly. "Good." Her attorney negotiated a separation package from Hargrove that Carol described as appropriate given the circumstances, which I understand means she fought for it and got it. Victoria's voice had something in it. She's the reason the emails exist in a form that could be used. Without her, the AG's case is technical fraud with no paper trail showing intent. With her, "I know," Adrian said. "I hope she knows that too." He looked down the alley. A sparrow was investigating something near the base of the building across the way, picking at it with the focused disinterest of a creature that didn't know it was being observed. Spring sparrows in Chicago alleys. It wasn't poetry, but it was something. The specific texture of a day that was continuing. "Adrian?" Victoria's voice had shifted again. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "I usually do." "I know. That's why I'm asking." A pause. "When you took this on, in the beginning, before you knew how it would go, were you scared?" He thought about it. Not the diplomatic version, not the version that made him sound more composed than he'd been. The actual answer. "Yes," he said. "I was scared I was wrong, and when I knew I was right, I was scared of what right was going to cost. And now?" He looked at the alley, the sparrow, the strip of April sky above the buildings. "Now I'm mostly tired and glad it went the way it went." He paused. "I think I was also angry, for 4 years, without knowing I was angry about it, and I don't think I knew how much I was carrying it until it was done." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said. "I think I understand that better than you might expect." He believed her. The deposition was in May. Carol had prepared him for it over 3 sessions in her office, running through the questions he'd likely face and the way to answer them, specifically, factually, without editorializing, without volunteering information that wasn't asked for. She'd been through enough depositions to know exactly how opposing counsel would try to introduce doubt. Through his credibility as an independent operator with a competitive interest in Hargrove's service reputation, through the 4-year gap between his original report and this investigation, through any inconsistency they could find between his various statements. He'd sat across from her in her office and worked through the preparation with the same attention he gave to technical documentation. She told him he was a good deponent, which meant he answered what was asked and stopped. The actual deposition was held in a conference room at the AG's office, with attorneys from both the AG's side and Hargrove's current legal team present, along with a court reporter and a video recorder. Gerald Marsh was not in the room. His name had appeared in the emails in a context that had apparently necessitated his own separate legal situation, which Carol had described with the precise language of someone who was not going to say more than she was entitled to say. The deposition lasted 4 hours. When it was done, Adrian walked out of the building into a May afternoon that was genuinely warm for the first time all year, the kind of day that felt like an argument won, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before calling Ricky to check on the Bay schedule. "How'd it go?" Ricky asked. "Fine. Straightforward." "They try anything?" They tried a few things. None of them landed. He started walking toward the parking garage where he'd left the van. "How's the Subaru?" "Done. Mrs. Park's Camry is in. She brought cookies." "Save me one." "I ate yours already." "Of course you did." He walked the 2 blocks to the parking garage in the May afternoon with his jacket over his arm, and the city moved around him with the ordinary, purposeful noise of a weekday afternoon. And he thought about 4 hours of questions and 4 years of carrying something, and how the two things were related in a way he couldn't quite articulate but felt precisely. The deposition was not the end of the legal process. The formal proceedings would continue for months. There would be more documentation requests, more verified statements, the eventual regulatory ruling, and the civil settlement negotiations, and the structured remediation plan that the AG's office and Hargrove's team were still building the framework for. Law moved at the speed it moved, and the gap between a thing being true and a thing being legally settled was where a lot of the weight lived. But the deposition was for Adrian a kind of close. The moment when everything he'd documented and proved and testified to passed fully out of his hands and into a process larger than him. A process that would do what it did, imperfectly, slowly, incompletely, but with the institutional weight of something that couldn't be talked out of its own findings. He'd handed it over. He got in the van and drove back to the shop. The formal regulatory ruling came down in October. Carol called him the morning it was issued, at 7:45, before he'd left for the shop. She read him the key findings over the phone in her measured, precise voice. Hargrove Premier Auto Group found to have engaged in systematic deceptive trade practices over a period of not less than 4 years. Civil penalties of $840,000. Mandatory remediation fund of $2.3 million for identified affected customers. Court-supervised compliance monitoring for 3 years under the terms of a negotiated consent decree. Marcus Shaw had entered a separate resolution 3 weeks earlier. A civil consent judgment that barred him from holding a management role in any automotive service business in Illinois for 10 years, and required the disgorgement of a portion of his compensation during the relevant period. Criminal referral from the AG's office was noted as a possibility pending review of additional evidence, which Carol explained in the careful language of someone who knew what was likely but wasn't going to overstate it. "The original report," Carol said. "It's included in the ruling as a documented prior disclosure that was knowingly suppressed. That's on the record." He'd known it was coming. She told him the ruling would reference it, but hearing it said aloud had a specific quality. The report that had gone into a system 4 years ago and come out nothing was now a documented fact in a regulatory ruling. It had an official existence in a way it hadn't had before, and the official existence changed what it meant about the 4 years of silence that had followed it. "Adrian," Carol said when he'd been quiet for a moment, "are you all right?" "Yes," he said, and then, because it was true, "I'm better than all right." She made the sound she made when she was satisfied with an answer. The remediation fund disbursements should complete by December. 27 accounts in total once the final audit review is finished. 27. The monitoring team found accounts in the second and third audit sweep that weren't in the initial identification. Some of them go back 5 years. A pause. The total refund value is closer to $2.6 million with interest and penalties. He thought about 27 accounts. He thought about the accounts payable departments and the finance teams and the fleet managers who'd reviewed invoices that looked legitimate and moved them through the system. He thought about the ones who'd called their service contact at Hargrove with a question and been given a confident, authoritative answer by someone who knew exactly why the vehicles had failed and exactly how much the answer was worth. "Is there anything else I need to do?" he asked. "Not from your end. The legal process is complete as far as your involvement is concerned. If there's a criminal referral and they need you for testimony, Carol will contact you, but we're not holding our breath on timeline." She paused. "You're done, Adrian. Whatever comes next is institutional." He stood in his apartment with the phone and looked at the kitchen window where the October light was coming in at the low angle of fall. The same window where he'd stood in January with a cup of coffee trying to build an innocent explanation for 8 identical failures and failing to find one. "Thank you, Carol," he said. "Thank you for the documentation," she said. "Cases like this rise or fall on the documentation. Yours was exceptional." A brief pause, and then, in a slightly different register, "You did the right thing. It cost you something to do it. And you did it anyway. That matters. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said what he'd said to Dennis months ago. I just kept the files. No, she said. You kept the files and you did something with them when it mattered. That's not the same thing. The shop on a Friday evening in late October had the specific atmosphere of a week that had been full and was now finishing. Ricky was closing up the new bay, running through the end-of-day checklist with the methodical efficiency he'd developed over 4 years. Equipment off in order, diagnostic stations logged out, lift lowered, bay door secured. Priya had left at 5 for a parent-teacher conference, stopping to tell Adrian that the brake job on the Infinity in Bay 1 was done and documented, and that the client had been notified, which Adrian already knew but appreciated being told because it was the kind of technician behavior he'd come to rely on. Adrian was at the workbench writing up the week's technical notes, a habit he'd had since the beginning of the shop, a record of what he'd found and what he'd done and what he'd learned, partly for reference and partly because he was the kind of person who processed things by writing them down. He'd been doing it for 6 years, and the notebooks were stacked on a shelf above the bench in chronological order, and occasionally he pulled one out to check something and noticed, in the handwriting and the technical shorthand, the particular moment in time the entry came from. He was writing the October notes when Ricky appeared in the bay doorway. You need me for anything else? Ricky said. No, go home. Ricky nodded, started to leave, then stopped. The ruling came down today. This morning. I saw it online. My wife showed me at lunch. He leaned against the door frame. 2.6 million. That's the number. Ricky looked at him for a moment with the expression he wore when he was saying something he'd been thinking about for a while. You know what I keep thinking about? The fuse. What about it? $20. That's what this whole thing costs to fix. $20 part, hour of labor. He shook his head slightly. And 2.6 million in fake repairs. All of it sitting on a $20 fuse that someone figured out they could blow and nobody would ever check. Nobody did check, Adrian said, for 4 years. Until you did. He looked at Ricky. The bay light was on behind him, the new bay visible through the open door to the left. Priya's clean workbench visible in there. Tools organized, floor swept. The professional tidiness of someone who understood that how you kept your space was a statement about how you did your work. Ricky, Adrian said. You've been here 4 years. 4 years in March. You're a better technician than you were when you started. Ricky looked at him with the slightly suspicious expression he wore when compliments arrived without context. Okay. I'm not leading anywhere with it. I'm just saying it because I don't say it enough. Adrian looked at the notebook in front of him. You worked this case with me from the beginning. You ran the diagnostics on all 8 vehicles. You helped build the documentation package. You kept the shop running while I was in meetings and depositions. He paused. That mattered. Well, Ricky was quiet for a moment. Then, you're doing that thing again. What thing? The thing where you let something land. Adrian thought about that. Maybe. It's a good thing, Ricky said. You should do it more. He pushed off the door frame. Good night, Adrian. Good night. After he left, the shop was quiet, in the way it was quiet on Friday evenings, a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of early mornings, fuller somehow, the accumulated weight of a week's work settled into the space. Adrian sat at the bench and wrote his notes for another 20 minutes, and then he put the notebook away and looked at the shop around him. 2 bays, 3 technicians, an appointment schedule that was full through mid-November, a corporate service contract that had changed the financial foundation of the place in ways he was still adjusting to. A stack of 6 years of notebooks on the shelf above the bench. This was not the triumphant version of the story. He knew that. The triumphant version would have him feeling something cleaner, something more complete, something that resolved with the satisfying finality of a problem solved and a lesson delivered. What he actually felt was more complicated and less comfortable than that, which was probably the honest version. 27 accounts had been defrauded over 4 years. 27 companies and their employees and their clients had been affected by invoices that were lies dressed up in diagnostic language. Some of those people had questioned the estimates and been talked out of their doubts by someone more confident and credentialed. Some of them had probably felt, in some inarticulate way, that something was wrong, and had paid anyway because the alternative was harder. Some of them had never doubted it at all because they had no reason to, because they trusted that the system they were operating in had a floor, a basic level of honesty that made it function, and that floor had not been there. A lot of what he felt was about those people, not about Marcus Shaw, who would face whatever he faced, or about the regulatory penalties, which would be paid and absorbed, or about Hargrove Premier, which would survive under new management and court-supervised compliance and emerge in 3 years as a different version of itself that may or may not deserve the difference. He felt things about all of that, but the feelings were manageable. The feelings he couldn't fully manage were about the 27 accounts, and the ones the audit hadn't found, and the ones that existed in a time window the investigation couldn't reach. He thought about Jerome Watts working HVAC in a different city, saying okay on the phone like a man putting something down he'd been carrying for 3 years. He thought about Sandra Okafor at a new job, operations management, building something after having done the thing that cost her the previous thing. He thought about Dennis Marsh, who had been right to give Victoria his name and wrong for a long time, not to have given it to someone sooner, who carried his own weight from that, which Adrian neither blamed him for nor excused, because blame and excuse weren't the categories that applied. He thought about the tech who'd found the fuse before he had, and written nothing down, or written it down and said nothing, or said something and been told to drop it. All the people before him who'd stood at the same edge he'd stood at and made a different calculation. He didn't know who those people were. He probably never would. But they existed, and the system had worked as long as it had because of their silence as much as because of Shaw's decisions. That was the part that didn't resolve. That was the part that stayed. He turned off the bay light, locked the shop door, and walked to his car in the October evening. The street had the fall smell of leaves and cold coming, and the distant suggestion of someone burning something 2 or 3 blocks over, the specific urban version of that smell, contained, second-hand, already fading. He sat in the car for a moment without starting it. There was a thing he'd been thinking about since the deposition, since the October ruling, since the conversation with Jerome. Not a conclusion exactly, more like an understanding that had been assembling itself piece by piece over the previous 9 months, and had now reached a form he could articulate, at least to himself. The system hadn't failed because Marcus Shaw was uniquely corrupt. It had failed because corruption in institutional settings doesn't announce itself. It arrives in small adjustments, a reframing here, a buried report there, a deliberate ambiguity in the language of an internal email. It arrives in the accumulated weight of everyone who looked at it and weighed their own exposure and decided the math didn't work. It survives not because it's invisible, but because visibility isn't enough. Because seeing something and knowing what to do about it are 2 different things, and the distance between them is where most of what goes wrong in the world goes wrong. Adrian had seen it. He'd written it down. He'd lost his job and spent 4 years telling himself he might have been wrong, and one January night deciding he'd been right all along and building a case out of a yellow legal pad and a blown fuse and a 4-year-old document he'd kept because he kept documentation. He wasn't a hero. He didn't feel like one, and he'd been in enough situations to know that the heroic version of any story was usually the version missing most of the detail. He was a mechanic who'd noticed something that didn't fit and had too much difficulty looking the other way to do it comfortably. That was about the size of it. But the not looking away mattered. He believed that. He believed it not as a moral principle, not as a position, but as a practical fact that the previous 9 months had demonstrated in a way he couldn't argue with. That one person paying precise attention to a small thing had produced a chain of events that returned $2.6 million to 27 companies and put a formal regulatory finding on the record and ended a 4-year practice that had been survivable specifically because no one had stopped to ask why 8 vehicles failed in exactly the same way. He started the car. The heater came on and the radio came on with it. A station he'd had set for years that played nothing he particularly chose, but that provided the right amount of ambient noise for driving. He pulled out of the space and into the Friday evening traffic, the ordinary mass of people going home from whatever their week had been. He thought about the shop. The new bay with the new lift, Priya's clean workbench, Ricky's referral log with its added column, the appointment book full through mid-November, the corporate contract that was the floor under everything now, the stability he'd spent 6 years building toward without ever quite achieving it. None of it was what he would have designed if you'd given him a blank page. None of it was the outcome of a plan. It was the outcome of paying attention to a pattern that shouldn't exist and refusing to talk himself out of what it meant, and the cascade that followed from that, and the 8 months of legal process and depositions and regulatory findings and phone calls and $20 fuses that followed the cascade. He drove home through the Friday evening traffic, the October dark coming down over the city, the lights coming on building by building as the sky went from gray to something darker. He thought about nothing in particular for several blocks, which was unusual for him. He was not by habit a person who thought about nothing. But there were moments when the brain earned a rest from itself, and this felt like one of them. He parked in front of his building, sat in the car for a moment. He thought about something Ricky had said months ago, back in February, when the shop had started getting noticeably busier, and Adrian had been cautiously trying to understand why. Ricky had said, "People trust the guy who told the truth when it was hard. That's not a marketing strategy. That's just what happens." Adrian had not known how to respond to that at the time. He still wasn't sure he did. But sitting in the car in the October evening, 9 months after a phone call from an unlisted number, he thought that Ricky was probably right, and that the version of right he was describing was not comfortable or clean or fully resolved. It was the ordinary, imperfect, continuing version, the kind that asked something of you every day and didn't provide a finish line. He got out of the car, locked it, walked to his building in the cold, the sparrow in the alley, the blown fuse in the evidence bag, the 4-year-old report in the manila folder, the 14-hour gap between the parts order and the completed diagnostic. Jerome's okay on the phone, Sandra at a new job, Ricky's referral log, the $20 part sitting at the center of a $2.6 million lie. He took the stairs. On the 3rd-floor landing, his neighbor Mrs. Delacroix was coming out of her apartment with a bag of trash and gave him the nod she gave him every time she saw him, brief, acknowledging, requiring nothing in return, the language of people who lived near each other and had established a mutual policy of benign coexistence. "Evening," she said. "Evening," he said. He unlocked his door and went inside. The apartment was the same it always was. The desk in the corner, the kitchen window, the laptop with its scratch on the corner where he dropped it 2 years ago. The ordinary architecture of a life that was continuing. He put his jacket on the hook by the door, went to the kitchen, made coffee that was probably too late in the day for coffee, which he'd been telling himself for years without acting on it. He stood at the window with the coffee and looked at the street below, where the Friday evening was doing what Friday evenings did. The slightly looser movement of people, the restaurants filling, someone laughing at something across the street with the particular volume of genuine amusement that carried further than people realized. He thought, the quiet ones see everything, not because they're looking harder, because they're not distracted by the performance of looking. Because attention, real attention, was the rarest thing in rooms full of people who had decided what they already knew, and the only quality that the broken systems and the buried reports and the $200,000 estimates had never been able to fully account for. Someone would always stop and look, eventually. That wasn't comfort exactly, it was just true, and true was what he had, and tonight it was enough. He finished the coffee, washed the cup, went to bed. Tomorrow the shop would open at 7, and the bays would fill, and the appointment book would give the day its shape, and somewhere in the ordinary work of it, a brake job, a transmission diagnostic, a check engine light that turned out to be nothing, and one that turned out to be something, the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly would accumulate in the way it always did, quietly, without announcement. It was not a large life. He had never particularly wanted a large one. It was an honest one. That, in the end, was the whole of it.